Warning to the Curious by M.R.James and read by Christopher Holton. The place on the east coast which the reader is asked to consider is Seaburgh. It is not very different now from what I remember it to have been when I was a child. Marshes intersected by dykes to the south, recalling the early chapters of Great Expectations, flat fields to the north merging into heath, fir woods and, above all, gorse inland. A long seafront and a street. Behind that, a spacious church of flint with a broad solid western tower and a peal of 6 bells. How well I remember their sound on a hot Sunday in August as our party went slowly up the white dusty slope of road towards them, for the church stands at the top of a short steep incline. They rang with a flat clacking sort of sound on those hot days, but when the air was softer they were mellower too. The railway ran down to its little terminus farther along the same road. There was a gay white windmill just before you came to the station, and another down near the shingle at the south end of the town, and others on higher ground to the north. There were cottages of bright red brick with slate roofs. But why do I encumber you with these commonplace details? The fact is that they come crowding to the point of the pencil when it begins to write of Seaburgh. I should like to be sure that I had allowed the right ones to get onto the paper, but I forgot. I have not quite done with the word painting business yet. Walk away from the sea and the town, past the station, and turn up the road on the right. It is a sandy road, parallel with the railway, and if you follow it, it climbs to somewhat higher ground. On your left, you are now going northward, is heath. On your right, the side towards the sea, is a belt of old firs, wind-beaten, thick at the top, with the slope that old seaside trees have. Seen on the skyline from the train, they would tell you in an instant, if you did not know it, that you were approaching a windy coast. Well, at the top of my little hill, a line of these firs strikes out and runs towards the sea, for there is a ridge that goes that way, and the ridge ends in a rather well-defined mound commanding the level fields of rough grass, and a little knot of fir trees crowns it. And here you may sit on a hot spring day, very well content to look at blue sea, white windmills, red cottages, bright green grass, church tower, and distant Martello Tower on the south. As I have said, I began to know Seaburgh as a child, but a gap of a good many years separates my early knowledge from that which is more recent. Still it keeps its place in my affections, and any tales of it that I pick up have an interest for me. One such tale is this. It came to me in a place very remote from Seaburgh, and quite accidentally from a man whom I had been able to oblige, enough in his opinion to justify his making me his confidant to this extent. "I know all that country more or less," he said. "I used to go to Seaburgh pretty regularly for golf in the spring. I generally put up at the Bear with a friend, Henry Long it was, you knew him perhaps." "Slightly," I said, "and we used to take a sitting room and be very happy there. Since he died, I haven't cared to go there, and I don't know that I should anyhow after the particular thing that happened on our last visit. It was in April 19th, and we were there, and by some chance we were almost the only people in the hotel, so the ordinary public rooms were practically empty, and we were the more surprised when, after dinner, our sitting-room door opened and a young man put his head in. We were aware of this young man. He was rather a rabbity, anemic subject, light hair and light eyes, but not unpleasing. So when he said, "I beg your pardon, is this a private room?" we did not growl and say, "Yes, it is," but Long said, or I did, no matter which, "Please come in." "Oh, may I?" he said, and seemed relieved. Of course, it was obvious that he wanted company, and as he was a reasonable kind of person, not the sort to bestow his whole family history on you, we urged him to make himself at home. "I dare say you find the other rooms rather bleak," I said. Yes, he did, but it was really too good of us, and so on. That being got over, he made some pretence of reading a book. Long was playing Patience I was writing. It became plain to me after a few minutes that this visitor of ours was in rather a state of fidgets or nerves, which communicated itself to me, and so I put away my writing and turned to it, engaging him in talk. After some remarks which I forget, he became rather confidential. "You'll think it very odd of me," this was the sort of way he began, "but the fact is, I've had something of a shock." Well, I recommended a drink of some cheering kind, and we had it. The waiter coming in made an interruption, and I thought our young man seemed very jumpy when the door opened. But after a while he got back to his woes again. There was nobody he knew in the place, and he did happen to know who we both were. It turned out there was some common acquaintance in town, and really he did want a word of advice if we didn't mind. Of course we both said, "By all means," or "Not at all," and Long put away his cards, and we settled down to hear what his difficulty was. "It began," he said, "more than a week ago when I bicycled over to Froston, only about 5 or 6 miles, to see the church. I'm very much interested in architecture, and it's got one of those pretty porches with niches and shields. I took a photograph of it, and then an old man who was tidying up in the churchyard came and asked if I'd care to look into the church. I said yes, and he produced a key and let me in. There wasn't much inside, but I told him it was a nice little church, and he kept it very clean. But, I said, the porch is the best part of it. We were just outside the porch then, and he said, "Ah, yes, that is a nice porch. And do you know, sir, what's the meaning of that coat of arms there?" It was the one with the 3 crowns, and though I'm not much of a herald, I was able to say yes. I thought it was the old arms of the kingdom of East Anglia. "That's right, sir," he said. "And do you know the meaning of them 3 crowns that's on it?" I said I'd no doubt it was known, but I couldn't recollect to have heard it myself. "Well then," he said, "for all you're a scholard, I can tell you something you don't know. Them's the 3 holy crowns what was buried in the ground near by the coast to keep the Germans from landing. Ah, I can see you don't believe that. But I tell you, if it hadn't have been for one of them holy crowns being there still, them Germans would have landed here time and again, they would. Landed with their ships and killed man, woman and child in their beds. Now then, that's the truth what I'm telling you, that is. And if you don't believe me, you ask the rector. There he comes. You asked him, I says. I looked round, and there was the rector, a nice-looking old man coming up the path. And before I could begin assuring my old man, who was getting quite excited that I didn't disbelieve him, the rector struck in and said, "What's all this about, John? Good day to you, sir. Have you been looking at our little church?" So then there was a little talk which allowed the old man to calm down, and then the rector asked him again what was the matter. "Oh," he said, "it weren't nothing, only I was telling this gentleman he'd ought to ask you about them holy crowns." "Ah, yes, to be sure," said the rector. "That's a very curious matter, isn't it? But I don't know whether the gentleman is interested in our old stories, eh?" "Oh, he'll be interested fast enough," says the old man. "He'll put his confidence in what you tells him, sir. Why, you known William Ager yourself, father and son too." Then I put in a word to say how much I should like to hear all about it, and before many minutes I was walking up the village street with the rector, who had 1 or 2 words to say to parishioners, and then to the rectory, where he took me into his study. He had made out on the way that I really was capable of taking an intelligent interest in a piece of folklore, and not quite the ordinary tripper. So he was very willing to talk, and it is rather surprising to me that the particular legend he told me has not made its way into print before. His account of it was this. There has always been a belief in these parts in the 3 holy crowns. The old people say they were buried in different places near the coast to keep off the Danes or the French or the Germans, and they say that one of the 3 was dug up a long time ago, and another has disappeared by the encroaching of the sea, and one still left doing its work, keeping off invaders. Well now, if you have read the ordinary guides and histories of this county, you will remember perhaps that in 1687 a crown which was said to be the crown of Redwald, King of the East Angles, was dug up at Rendlesham, and alas, alas, melted down before it was even properly described or drawn. Well, Rendlesham isn't on the coast, but it isn't so very far inland, and it's on a very important line of access, and I believe that is the crown which the people mean when they say that one has been dug up. Then on the south you don't want me to tell you where there was a Saxon royal palace, which is now under the sea, eh? Well, there was the second crown, I take it, and between these two, they say, lies the third. Do they say where it is? Of course, I asked. He said, yes, indeed they do, but they don't tell, and his manner did not encourage me to put the obvious question. Instead of that, I waited a moment and said, what did the old man mean when he said you knew William Agar, as if that had something to do with the crowns? To be sure, he said. Now that's another curious story. These Agers, it's a very old name in these parts, but I can't find that they were ever people of quality or big owners. These Agers say or said that their branch of the family were the guardians of the last crown. A certain old Nathaniel Agar was the first one I knew. I was born and brought up quite near here, and he, I believe, camped out at the place during the whole of the War of 1870. William, his son, did the same, I know, during the South African War, and young William, his son, who has only died fairly recently, took lodgings at the cottage nearest the spot, and I've no doubt hastened his end, for he was a consumptive by exposure and night watching, and he was the last of that branch. It was a dreadful grief to him to think that he was the last, but he could do nothing. The only relations at all near to him were in the colonies. I wrote letters for him to them, imploring them to come over on business, very important to the family, but there has been no answer. So the last of the Holy Crowns, if it's there, has no guardian now. That was what the rector told me, and you can fancy how interesting I found it. The only thing I could think of when I left him was how to hit upon the spot where the crown was supposed to be. I wish I'd left it alone. But there was a sort of fate in it, for as I bicycled back past the churchyard wall, my eye caught a fairly new gravestone, and on it was the name of William Agar. Of course, I got off and read it. It said, of this parish, died at Seaburgh, 19, aged 28. There it was, you see, a little judicious questioning in the right place, and I should at least find the cottage nearest the spot. Only I didn't quite know what was the right spot to begin my questioning at. Again there was fate. It took me to the curiosity shop down that way, you know, and I turned over some old books. And if you please, one was a prayer book of 1740 odd, in a rather handsome binding. I'll just go and get it. It's in my room. He left us in a state of some surprise, but we had hardly time to exchange any remarks when he was back, panting, and handed us the book opened at the flyleaf, on which was, in a straggly hand, Nathaniel Agar is my name, and England is my nation. Seaburgh is my dwelling place, and Christ is my salvation. When I am dead and in my grave, and all my bones are rotten, I hope the Lord will think on me when I am quite forgotten. This poem was dated 1754, and there were many more entries of Agers, Nathaniel, Frederick, William, and so on, ending with William 19. You see, he said, anybody would call it the greatest bit of luck. I did, but I don't now. Of course I asked the shopman about William Agar, and of course he happened to remember that he lodged in a cottage in the North Field and died there. This was just chalking the road for me. I knew which the cottage must be. There is only one sizable one about there. The next thing was to scrape some sort of acquaintance with the people, and I took a walk that way at once. A dog did the business for me. He made at me so fiercely that they had to run out and beat him off, and then naturally begged my pardon, and we got into talk. I had only to bring up Agar's name and pretend I knew or thought I knew something of him, and then the woman said how sad it was him dying so young, and she was sure it came of him spending the night out of doors in the cold weather. Then I had to say, did he go out on the sea at night? And she said, oh no, it was on the hillock yonder with the trees on it. And there I was. I know something about digging in these barrows. I've opened many of them in the down country. But that was with owner's leave and in broad daylight and with men to help. I had to prospect very carefully here before I put a spade in. I couldn't trench across the mound, and with those old firs growing there I knew there would be awkward tree roots. Still, the soil was very light and sandy and easy, and there was a rabbit hole or so that might be developed into a sort of tunnel. The going out and coming back at odd hours to the hotel was going to be the awkward part. When I made up my mind about the way to excavate, I told the people that I was called away for a night, and I spent it out there. I made my tunnel. I won't bore you with the details of how I supported it and filled it in when I'd done, but the main thing is that I got the crown. Naturally, we both broke out into exclamations of surprise and interest. I, for one, had long known about the finding of the crown at Rendlesham and had often lamented its fate. No one has ever seen an Anglo-Saxon crown. At least no one had. But our man gazed at us with a rueful eye. "Yes," he said, "and the worst of it is I don't know how to put it back." "Put it back?" we cried out. "Why, my dear sir, you've made one of the most exciting finds ever heard of in this country. Of course it ought to go to the jewel house at the Tower. What's your difficulty? If you're thinking about the owner of the land and treasure trove and all that, we can certainly help you through. Nobody's going to make a fuss about technicalities in a case of this kind." Probably more was said, but all he did was to put his face in his hands and mutter, "I don't know how to put it back." At last Long said, "You'll forgive me, I hope, if I seem impertinent, but are you quite sure you've got it?" I was wanting to ask much the same question myself, for of course the story did seem a lunatic's dream when one thought over it. But I hadn't quite dared to say what might hurt the poor young man's feelings. However, he took it quite calmly, really with the calm of despair, you might say. He sat up and said, "Oh yes, there's no doubt of that. I have it here in my room, locked up in my bag. You can come and look at it if you like. I won't offer to bring it here." We were not likely to let the chance slip. We went with him. His room was only a few doors off. The boots was just collecting shoes in the passage, or so we thought. Afterwards we were not sure. Our visitor, his name was Paxton, was in a worse state of shivers than before, and went hurriedly into the room, and beckoned us after him, turned on the light, and shut the door carefully. Then he unlocked his kit bag and produced a bundle of clean pocket handkerchiefs in which something was wrapped, laid it on the bed, and undid it. I can now say I have seen an actual Anglo-Saxon crown. It was of silver, as the Rendlesham one is always said to have been. It was set with some gems, mostly antique intaglios and cameos, and was of rather plain, almost rough workmanship. In fact, it was like those you see on the coins and in the manuscripts. I found no reason to think it was later than the 9th century. I was intensely interested, of course, and I wanted to turn it over in my hands, but Paxton prevented me. "Don't you touch it," he said. "I'll do that." And with a sigh that was, I declare to you, dreadful to hear, he took it up and turned it about so that we could see every part of it. "Seen enough?" he said at last, and we nodded. He wrapped it up and locked it in his bag and stood looking at us dumbly. "Come back to our room," Long said, "and tell us what the trouble is." He thanked us and said, "Will you go first and see if the coast is clear?" That wasn't very intelligible, for our proceedings hadn't been, after all, very suspicious, and the hotel, as I said, was practically empty. However, we were beginning to have inklings of we didn't know what, and anyhow nerves are infectious, so we did go, first peering out as we opened the door, and fancying, I found we both had the fancy, that a shadow, or more than a shadow, but it made no sound, passed from before us to one side as we came out into the passage. "It's all right," we whispered to Paxton. Whispering seemed the proper tone, and we went, with him between us, back to our sitting room. I was preparing, when we got there, to be ecstatic about the unique interest of what we had seen, but when I looked at Paxton, I saw that would be terribly out of place, and I left it to him to begin. "What is to be done?" was his opening. Long thought it right, as he explained to me afterwards, to be obtuse and said, "Why not find out who the owner of the land is and inform—" "Oh, no, no," Paxton broke in impatiently. "I beg your pardon. You've been very kind, but don't you see it's got to go back, and I daren't be there at night, and daytime's impossible. Perhaps, though, you don't see. Well then, the truth is that I've never been alone since I touched it." I was beginning some fairly stupid comment, but Long caught my eye and I stopped. Long said, "I think I do see, perhaps, but wouldn't it be a relief to tell us a little more clearly what the situation is?" Then it all came out. Paxton looked over his shoulder and beckoned to us to come nearer to him and began speaking in a low voice. We listened most intently, of course, and compared notes afterwards, and I wrote down our version, so I am confident I have what he told us, almost word for word. He said, "It began when I was first prospecting and put me off again and again. There was always somebody, a man, standing by one of the firs. This was in daylight, you know. He was never in front of me. I always saw him with the tail of my eye on the left or the right, and he was never there when I looked straight for him. I would lie down for quite a long time and take careful observations and make sure there was no one. And then, when I got up and began prospecting again, there he was. And he began to give me hints besides, for wherever I put that prayer book, short of locking it up, which I did at last, when I came back to my room, it was always out on my table, open at the flyleaf where the names are, and one of my razors across it to keep it open. I'm sure he just can't open my bag, or something more would have happened. You see, he's light and weak, but all the same I daren't face him. Well then, when I was making the tunnel, of course it was worse, and if I hadn't been so keen, I should have dropped the whole thing and run. It was like someone scraping at my back all the time. I thought for a long time it was only soil dropping on me, but as I got nearer the crown, it was unmistakable. And when I actually laid it bare and got my fingers into the ring of it and pulled it out, there came a sort of cry behind me. Oh, I can't tell you how desolate it was, and horribly threatening too. It spoilt all my pleasure in my find, cut it off that moment. And if I hadn't been the wretched fool I am, I should have put the thing back and left it. But I didn't. The rest of the time was just awful. I had hours to get through before I could decently come back to the hotel. First I spent time filling up my tunnel and covering my tracks, and all the while he was there trying to thwart me. Sometimes, you know, you see him and sometimes you don't, just as he pleases, I think. He's there, but he has some power over your eyes. Well, I wasn't off the spot very long before sunrise, and then I had to get to the junction for Seaburgh and take a train back. And though it was daylight fairly soon, I don't know if that made it much better. There were always hedges or gorse bushes or park fences along the road, some sort of cover, I mean, and I was never easy for a second. And then when I began to meet people going to work, they always looked behind me very strangely. It might have been that they were surprised at seeing anyone so early, but I didn't think it was only that, and I don't now. They didn't look exactly at me. And the porter at the train was like that too. And the guard held open the door after I'd got into the carriage, just as he would if there was somebody else coming, you know. "Oh, you may be very sure it isn't my fancy," he said with a dull sort of laugh. Then he went on. "And even if I do get it put back, he won't forgive me, I can tell that. And I was so happy a fortnight ago." He dropped into a chair, and I believe he began to cry. We didn't know what to say, but we felt we must come to the rescue somehow, and so, it really seemed the only thing, we said if he was so set on putting the crown back in its place, we would help him. And I must say that after what we had heard, it did seem the right thing. If these horrid consequences had come on this poor man, might there not really be something in the original idea of the crown having some curious power bound up with it to guard the coast? At least that was my feeling, and I think it was Long's too. Our offer was very welcome to Paxton anyhow. When could we do it? It was nearing 10:30. Could we contrive to make a late walk plausible to the hotel people that very night? We looked out of the window. there was a brilliant full moon, the Paschal moon. Long undertook to tackle the boots and propitiate him. He was to say that we should not be much over the hour, and if we did find it so pleasant that we stopped out a bit longer, we would see that he didn't lose by sitting up. Well, we were pretty regular customers of the hotel, and did not give much trouble, and were considered by the servants to be not under the mark in the way of tips, and so the boots was propitiated, and let us out onto the seafront, and remained, as we heard later, looking after us. Paxton had a large coat over his arm, under which was the wrapped-up crown. So we were off on this strange errand before we had time to think how very much out of the way it was. I have told this part quite shortly on purpose, for it really does represent the haste with which we settled our plan and took action. "The shortest way is up the hill and through the churchyard," Paxton said, as we stood a moment before the hotel looking up and down the front. There was nobody about, nobody at all. Seaburgh out of the season is an early quiet place. "We can't go along the dyke by the cottage because of the dog," Paxton also said, when I pointed to what I thought a shorter way along the front and across 2 fields. The reason he gave was good enough. We went up the road to the church and turned in at the churchyard gate. I confess to having thought that there might be some lying there who might be conscious of our business, but if it was so, they were also conscious that one who was on their side, so to say, had us under surveillance, and we saw no sign of them. But under observation we felt we were, as I have never felt it at another time. Especially was it so when we passed out of the churchyard into a narrow path with close high hedges through which we hurried as Christian did through that valley, and so got out into open fields. Then along hedges, though I would sooner have been in the open, where I could see if anyone was visible behind me, over a gate or two, and then a swerve to the left, taking us up onto the ridge which ended in that mound. As we neared it, Henry Long felt, and I felt too, that there were what I can only call dim presences waiting for us, as well as a far more actual one attending us. Of Paxton's agitation all this time, I can give you no adequate picture. He breathed like a hunted beast, and we could not either of us look at his face. How he would manage when we got to the very place we had not troubled to think. He had seemed so sure that that would not be difficult. Nor was it. I never saw anything like the dash with which he flung himself at a particular spot in the side of the mound and tore at it, so that in a very few minutes the greater part of his body was out of sight. We stood holding the coat and that bundle of handkerchiefs, and looking very fearfully, I must admit, about us. There was nothing to be seen. A line of dark firs behind us made one skyline, more trees and the church tower half a mile off on the right, cottages and a windmill on the horizon on the left, calm sea dead in front, faint barking of a dog at a cottage on a gleaming dyke between us and it, full moon making that path we know across the sea, the eternal whisper of the Scotch firs just above us and of the sea in front. Yet in all this quiet an acute and acrid consciousness of a restrained hostility very near us, like a dog on a leash that might be let go at any moment. Paxton pulled himself out of the hole and stretched a hand back to us. "Give it to me," he whispered, unwrapped. We pulled off the handkerchiefs, and he took the crown. The moonlight just fell on it as he snatched it. We had not ourselves touched that bit of metal, and I have thought since that it was just as well. In another moment Paxton was out of the hole again and busy shoveling back the soil with hands that were already bleeding. He would have none of our help, though. It was much the longest part of the job to get the place to look undisturbed. Yet I don't know how he made a wonderful success of it. At last he was satisfied, and we turned back. We were a couple of 100 yards from the hill when Long suddenly said to him, "I say, you've left your coat there. That won't do, see?" And I certainly did see it, the long dark overcoat lying where the tunnel had been. Paxton had not stopped, however. He only shook his head and held up the coat on his arm. And when we joined him, he said, without any excitement, but as if nothing mattered any more, "That wasn't my coat." And indeed, when we looked back again, that dark thing was not to be seen. Well, we got out onto the road and came rapidly back that way. It was well before 12 when we got in, trying to put a good face on it and saying, Long and I, what a lovely night it was for a walk. The Boots was on the lookout for us, and we made remarks like that for his edification as we entered the hotel. He gave another look up and down the seafront before he locked the front door and said, "You didn't meet many people about, I suppose, sir?" "No, indeed, not a soul," I said, at which I remember Paxton looked oddly at me. "Only I thought I see someone turn up the station road after you gentlemen," said the Boots. "Still, you was three together, and I don't suppose he meant mischief." I didn't know what to say. Long merely said good night, and we went off upstairs, promising to turn out all lights and to go to bed in a few minutes. Back in our room, we did our very best to make Paxton take a cheerful view. "There's the Crown safe back," we said. "Very likely you'd have done better not to touch it." And he heavily assented to that. But no real harm has been done, and we shall never give this away to anyone who would be so mad as to go near it. Besides, don't you feel better yourself? "I don't mind confessing," I said, "that on the way there I was very much inclined to take your view about being followed. But going back, it wasn't at all the same thing, was it? No, it wouldn't do." "You've nothing to trouble yourselves about," he said. "But I'm not forgiven. I've got to pay for that miserable sacrilege still. I know what you are going to say. The church might help. Yes, but it's the body that has to suffer. It's true I'm not feeling that he's waiting outside for me just now. But—" Then he stopped. Then he turned to thanking us, and we put him off as soon as we could. And naturally we pressed him to use our sitting room next day, and said we should be glad to go out with him. Or did he play golf, perhaps? Yes, he did, but he didn't think he should care about that tomorrow. Well, we recommended him to get up late and sit in our room in the morning while we were playing, and we would have a walk later in the day. He was very submissive and piano about it all, ready to do just what we thought best, but clearly quite certain in his own mind that what was coming could not be averted or palliated. You'll wonder why we didn't insist on accompanying him to his home and seeing him safe into the care of brothers or someone. The fact was, he had nobody. He had had a flat in town, but lately he had made up his mind to settle for a time in Sweden, and he had dismantled his flat and shipped off his belongings, and was whiling away a fortnight or 3 weeks before he made a start. Anyhow, we didn't see what we could do better than sleep on it, or not, sleep very much, as was my case, and see what we felt like tomorrow morning. We felt very different, Long and I, on as beautiful an April morning as you could desire, and Paxton also looked very different when we saw him at breakfast. "The first approach to a decent night I seem ever to have had," was what he said. But he was going to do as we had settled, stay in probably all the morning and come out with us later. We went to the links, we met some other men and played with them in the morning, and had lunch there rather early so as not to be late back. All the same, the snares of death overtook him. Whether it could have been prevented, I don't know. I think he would have been got at somehow, do what we might. Anyhow, this is what happened. We went straight up to our room. Paxton was there, reading quite peaceably. "Ready to come out shortly?" said Long. "Say in half an hour's time?" "Certainly," he said, and I said we would change first and perhaps have baths, and call for him in half an hour. I had my bath first and went and lay down on my bed and slept for about 10 minutes. We came out of our rooms at the same time and went together to the sitting room. Paxton wasn't there, only his book, nor was he in his room, nor in the downstairs rooms. We shouted for him. A servant came out and said, "Why, I thought you gentlemen was gone out already, and so did the other gentleman. He heard you a-calling from the parlour there and run out in a hurry, and I looked out of the coffee-room window, but I didn't see you. However, he run off down the beach that way." Without a word we ran that way too. It was the opposite direction to that of last night's expedition. It wasn't quite 4 o'clock, and the day was fair, though not so fair as it had been, so there was really no reason, you'd say, for anxiety. With people about, surely a man couldn't come to much harm. But something in our look as we ran out must have struck the servant, for she came out on the steps and pointed and said, "Yes, that's the way he went." We ran on as far as the top of the shingle bank and there pulled up. There was a choice of ways, past the houses on the seafront or along the sand at the bottom of the beach, which, the tide being now out, was fairly broad. Or, of course, we might keep along the shingle between these two tracks and have some view of both of them. Only that was heavy going. We chose the sand, for that was the loneliest, and someone might come to harm there without being seen from the public path. Long said he saw Paxton some distance ahead, running and waving his stick as if he wanted to signal to people who were on ahead of him. I couldn't be sure. One of these sea mists was coming up very quickly from the south. There was someone, that's all I could say. And there were tracks on the sand as of someone running who wore shoes, and there were other tracks made before those, for the shoes sometimes trod in them and interfered with them, of someone not in shoes. Oh, of course, it's only my word you've got to take for all this. Long's dead. We'd no time or means to make sketches or take casts, and the next tide washed everything away. All we could do was to notice these marks as we hurried on. But there they were over and over again, and we had no doubt whatever that what we saw was the track of a bare foot, and one that showed more bones than flesh. The notion of Paxton running after anything like this, and supposing it to be the friends he was looking for, was very dreadful to us. You can guess what we fancied, how the thing he was following might stop suddenly and turn round on him, and what sort of face it would show, half seen at first in the mist, which all the while was getting thicker and thicker. And as I ran on, wondering how the poor wretch could have been lured into mistaking that other thing for us, I remembered his saying, "He has some power over your eyes." And then I wondered what the end would be, for I had no hope now that the end could be averted, and, well, there is no need to tell all the dismal and horrid thoughts that flitted through my head as we ran on into the mist. It was uncanny, too, that the sun should still be bright in the sky and we could see nothing. We could only tell that we were now past the houses and had reached that gap there is between them and the old Martello Tower. When you are past the tower, you know there is nothing but shingle for a long way. Not a house, not a human creature, just that spit of land, or rather shingle, with the river on your right and the sea on your left. But just before that, just by the Martello Tower, you remember there is the old battery close to the sea. I believe there are only a few blocks of concrete left now. The rest has all been washed away, but at this time there was a lot more, though the place was a ruin. Well, when we got there, we clambered to the top as quick as we could to take breath and look over the shingle in front, if by chance the mist would let us see anything. But a moment's rest we must have. We had run a mile at least. Nothing whatever was visible ahead of us, and we were just turning by common consent to get down and run hopelessly on, when we heard what I can only call a laugh. And if you can understand what I mean by a breathless, a lungless laugh, you have it. But I don't suppose you can. It came from below and swerved away into the mist. That was enough. We bent over the wall. Paxton was there at the bottom. You don't need to be told that he was dead. His tracks showed that he had run along the side of the battery, had turned sharp around the corner of it, and, small doubt of it, must have dashed straight into the open arms of someone who was waiting there. His mouth was full of sand and stones, and his teeth and jaws were broken to bits. I only glanced once at his face. At the same moment, just as we were scrambling down from the battery to get to the body, we heard a shout and saw a man running down the bank of the Martello Tower. He was the caretaker stationed there, and his keen old eyes had managed to descry through the mist that something was wrong. He had seen Paxton fall, and had seen us a moment after, running up, fortunate this, for otherwise we could hardly have escaped suspicion of being concerned in the dreadful business. Had he, we asked, caught sight of anybody attacking our friend? He could not be sure. We sent him off for help and stayed by the dead man till they came with the stretcher. It was then that we traced out how he had come, on the narrow fringe of sand under the battery wall. The rest was shingle, and it was hopelessly impossible to tell whither the other had gone. What were we to say at the inquest? It was a duty, we felt, not to give up there and then the secret of the Crown to be published in every paper. I don't know how much he would have told, but what we did agree upon was this: to say that we had only made acquaintance with Paxton the day before, and that he had told us he was under some apprehension of danger at the hands of a man called William Ager. Also that we had seen some other tracks besides Paxton's when we followed him along the beach. But of course by that time everything was gone from the sands. No one had any knowledge, fortunately, of any William Ager living in the district. The evidence of the man at the Martello Tower freed us from all suspicion. All that could be done was to return a verdict of wilful murder by some person or persons unknown. Paxton was so totally without connections that all the inquiries that were subsequently made ended in a no thoroughfare. The end. The Step by E.F.Benson and read by Christopher Holton. John Cresswell was returning home one night from the Britannia Club at Alexandria, where, as was his custom 3 or 4 times in the week, he had dined very solidly and fluidly, and played bridge afterwards as long as the table could be formed. It had been rather an expensive evening, for all his skill at cards had been unable to cope with such a continuous series of ill-favoured hands as had been his. But he had consoled himself with reasonable doses of whisky, and now he stepped homewards in very cheerful spirits, for his business affairs were going most prosperously, and a loss of £25 or £30 tonight would be amply compensated for in the morning. Besides, his bridge account for the year showed a credit which proved that cards were a very profitable pleasure. It was a hot night of October, and being a big plethoric man, he strolled at a very leisurely pace across the square and up the long street at the far end of which was his house. There were no taxis on the rank, or he would have taken one and saved himself this walk of nearly a mile. But he had no quarrel with that, for the night air with a breeze from the sea was refreshing after so long a session in a smoke-laden atmosphere. Above, a moon near to its full cast a very clear white light on his road. There was a narrow strip of sharp-cut shadow beneath the houses on his right, but the rest of the street and the pavement on the left of it, where he walked, were in bright illumination. At first his way lay between rows of shops, European for the most part, with here and there a cafe where a few customers still lingered. Pleasant thoughts beguiled his progress. The Egyptian sugar crop in which he was much interested had turned out very well, and he saw a big profit on his options. Not less satisfactory were other businesses in which he did not figure so openly. He lent money, for instance, on a large scale to the native population, and these operations extended far up the Nile. Only last week he had been at Luxor, where he had concluded a transaction of a very remunerative sort. He had made a loan some months ago to a small merchant there, and now the appropriate interest on this was in default. In consequence, the harvest of a very fruitful acreage of sugar cane was his. A similar and even richer windfall had just come his way in Alexandria, for he had advanced money a year ago to a Levantine tobacco merchant on the security of his freehold store. This had brought him in very handsome interest, but a day or 2 ago the unfortunate fellow had failed, and Cresswell owned a most desirable freehold. The whole affair had been very creditable to his enterprise and sagacity, for he had privately heard that the municipality was intending to lay out the neighbourhood, a slum at present where this store was situated, in houses of flats, and make it a residential quarter, and his newly acquired freehold would thus become a valuable property. At present, the tobacco merchant lived with his family in holes and corners of the store, and they must be evicted tomorrow morning. John Cresswell had already arranged for this, and had told the man that he would have to quit. He would go round there in the forenoon and see that they and their sticks of furniture were duly bundled out into the street. He would see personally that this was done, and looked forward to doing so. The old couple were beastly creatures, the woman a perfect witch who eyed him and muttered, but there was a daughter who was not ill-looking, and someone of the beggared family would be obliged to earn bread. He did not dwell on this, but the thought just flitted through his brain. Then doors would be locked and windows barred in the store that was now his, and he would lunch at the club afterwards. He was popular there. He had a jovial geniality about him, and a habit of offering drinks before they could be offered to him. That too was good for business. 10 minutes strolling brought him to the end of the shops and cafes that formed the street, and now the road ran between residential houses, each detached and with a space of garden surrounding it, where dry-leaved palms rattled in this wind from the sea. He was approaching the flamboyant Roman Catholic church, to which was attached a monastic establishment, a big white barrack-looking house where the Brothers of Poverty or some such order lived. Something to do with St. Mark, he vaguely remembered, who by tradition had brought Christianity to Egypt nearly 1900 years ago. Often he met one of these odd, sandal-footed creatures with his brown habit, his rosary and his cowled head going in or out of their gate, or toiling in their garden. He did not like them. Lousy fellows, he would have called them. Sometimes in their mendicant errands they came to his door asking alms for the indigent Copts. Not long ago he had found one actually ringing the bell of his front door, instead of going humbly round to the back as befitted his quality, and Cresswell told him that he would loose his bulldog on the next of their breed, who ventured within his garden gate. How the fellow had skipped off when he heard talk of the dog. He dropped one of his sandals in his haste to be gone, and not sparing the time to adjust it again, had hopped and hobbled over the sharp gravel to gain the street. Cresswell had laughed aloud to see his precipitancy, and the best of the joke was that he had not got any sort of dog on his premises at all. At the remembrance of that humorous incident he grinned to himself as he passed the porch of the church. He paused a moment to mop his forehead and to light a cigarette, looking about him in great good humour. Before him and behind the road was quite empty. Lights gleamed behind Venetian shutters from a few upper windows of the houses, but all the world was in bed or on its way there. There were still 300 or 400 yards to go before he came to his house, and as he turned his face homewards again and walked a little more briskly, he heard a step behind him, sharp and distinct, not far in his rear. He paid no heed. Someone late like himself was going home, walking in the same direction, for the step followed him. His cigarette was ill-lit. A little core of burning stuff fell from it onto the pavement, and he stopped to rekindle it. Possibly some subconscious region of his mind was occupied with the step which had sprung up so oddly behind him in the empty street, for while he was getting his cigarette to burn again, he noticed that the step had ceased. It was hardly worthwhile to turn around, so little the matter interested him, but a casual glance showed him that the wayfarer must have turned into one of the houses he had just passed, for the whole street, brightly moonlit, was as empty as when he surveyed it a few minutes before. Soon he came to his own gate and clanged it behind him. The eviction of the Levantine merchant took place in the morning, and Cresswell watched his porters carrying out the tawdry furniture. A few tables, a few chairs, a sofa covered in tattered crimson plush, a couple of iron bedsteads, a bundle of dirty sheets and blankets. He was not certain in his own mind whether these paltry articles did not by rights belong to him, but they were fit for nothing except the dust heap, and he had no use for them. There they stood in the clean bright sunshine, rubbish and no more, blocking the pavement, and a policeman told their owner that he had best clear them away at once unless he wanted trouble. There was the usual scene to which he was quite accustomed, The man's wife, snivelling and slovenly, witch-like and early old, knelt and kissed his hand, and wheezingly besought his compassion. She called him Excellency. She promised him her prayers, which he desired as little as her pots and pans. She invoked blessings on his head, for she knew that out of his pity he would give them a little more time. They had nowhere to go, nor any roof to shelter them. Her husband had money owing to him, and he would collect these debts and pay his default as sure as there was a God in heaven. This was a changed note from her mutterings of yesterday, but of course Cresswell had a deaf ear for this oily rigmarole, and presently he went into the store to see that everything had been removed. It was in a filthy, dirty state, floors were rotten and the paint peeling, but the whole place would soon be broken up, and he was not going to spend a piastre on it, so long as the ground on which it stood was his. Then he saw to the barring of the windows and the doors, and he gave the policeman quite a handsome tip to keep an eye on the place and take care that these folk did not get ingress again. When he came out, he found that the old man had procured a handcart, and he and his son were loading it up, so of course they had somewhere to go. It was all a pack of lies about their being homeless. The old hag was squatting against the house wall, but now there were no more prayers and blessings for him, and she had taken to her mutterings again. As for the daughter, seen in the broad daylight, she had a handsome face, but she was sullen and dirty and forbidding, and he gave no further thought to her. He hailed a taxi and went off to the club for lunch, though Cresswell, in common parlance, did himself well, taking his fill of food and drink and tobacco. He was also careful of that great strong body of his, and the occasions were few when he omitted, at the end of the day's work, to walk out in the direction of Rumley for a brisk hour or two, or, during the hotter months, to have a good swim in the sea and a bask in the sun. On the day following this eviction, he took a tramp along the firm sands of the coast, and then, turning inland, struck the road that would bring him back to his own house. This stood quite at the end of the rows of detached houses past which he had walked 2 evenings before. Beyond, the road ran between tumbled sand dunes and scrub-covered flats. Here and there in sheltered hollows a few Arab goat herds and such had made themselves nomadic tent-like habitations of a primitive sort. Half a dozen posts set in the sand supported a roof of rugs and blankets stitched together. If they encroached too near the outskirts of the town, the authorities periodically made a clearance of them, for they were apt to be light-fingered, pilfering folk whose close vicinity was not desirable. Today, as he returned from his walk, Cresswell saw that a tent of this kind had newly been set up within 20 yards of his own garden wall. That would not do at all, that must be seen to, and he determined, as soon as he had had his bath and his change of clothes, to ring up his very good friend the Chief Inspector of Police and request its removal. As he got nearer to it, he saw that it was not quite of the usual type. The roof was clearly an outworn European carpet, and standing outside it on the sand were chairs and a sofa. Somehow these seemed familiar to him, though he could not localize the association. Then out of the tent came that old Levantine hag who had kissed his hand and knelt to him yesterday, invoking on him all sorts of blessings and prosperities, if only he would have compassion. She saw him, for now not more than a few dozen yards separated them, and then, suddenly pointing at him, she broke out into a gabble and yell of curses. That made him smile. "So you've changed your tune again, have you?" he thought. "For that doesn't sound much like good wishes. Curse away, old woman, if it relieves your mind, for it doesn't hurt me. But you'll have to be shifting once more, for I'm not going to have you and your like squatting there." Cresswell rang up his friend, the Chief Inspector of Police, and was most politely told that matter should be seen to in the morning. Sure enough, when he set out to go to his office next day, he saw that it was being attended to, for the European carpet which had served for a roof was already down, and the handcart was being laden with the stuff. He noticed quite casually that the 2 women and the boy were employed in lading it. The Levantine was lying on the sand and taking no part in the work. 2 days later he had occasion to pass the pauper cemetery of Alexandria, where the poorest kind of funeral was going on. The coffin was being pushed to the side of the shallow grave on a handcart. A boy and 2 women followed it. He could see who they were. He dined that night at the club in rare good humour with the affairs of life. Already the municipality had offered him for his newly acquired freehold a sum that was double the debt for which it had been security, and though possibly he might get more if he stuck out for a higher price, he had accepted it, and the money had been paid into his bank that day. To get 100% in a week was very satisfactory business, and who knew but that some new scheme of improvement might cause them to change their plans, leaving him with a ramshackle building on his hands for which he had no manner of use. He enjoyed his dinner and his wine, and particularly did he enjoy the rubber of bridge that followed. All went well with his finesses. He doubled his adversaries 2 or 3 times with the happiest results. They doubled him and were sorry for having spoken, and there would be a very pleasant item to enter in his card account that evening. It was later than usual when he quitted the club. Just outside there was a beggar woman squatting at the edge of the pavement, who held her palm towards him and whined out blessings. Good-naturedly he fumbled in his pocket for a couple of piastres, and the blessings poured out in greater shrillness and copiousness as she pushed back the black veil that half shrouded her face to thank him for his beneficence to the needy widow. Next moment she threw his arms on the pavement, she spat at him, and like a moth she flitted away into the shadows. Cresswell recognised her even as she had recognised him, and picked up his piastres. It was amusing to think that the old hag so hated him that even his arms were abhorrent to her. "I'll drop them into that collecting box outside the church," he thought to himself. Tonight, late though it was, there were many folk about in the square, natives for the most part, padding softly along, and there were still a few taxis on the rank. But he preferred to walk home, for he had been so busy all day that he had given his firm fat body no sort of exercise. So crossing the square he went up the street which led to his house. Here the cafes were already closed, and soon the pavements grew empty. The waning moon had risen, and though the lights of the street grew more sparse as he emerged into the residential quarter, his way lay bright before him. In his hand he still held the 2 piastres, which had been flung back at him, ready for the collection box. He walked briskly, for the night was cool, and it was no exercise to saunter. Not a breath of wind stirred the air, and the clatter of the dry palm leaves was dumb. He was now approaching the Roman Catholic Church, when a step suddenly sounded out crisp and distinct behind him. He remembered then, for the first time, what had happened some nights ago, and halted and listened. Not a sound broke the stillness. He whisked round, but the street seemed empty. On he went again, now more slowly, and there was the following step again, neither gaining on him nor falling behind. To judge by the loudness of it, it could not be more than a dozen paces in his rear. Then a very obvious explanation occurred to him. No doubt this was some echo of his own footsteps. He went more quickly, and the steps behind him quickened. He stopped, and they stopped. The whole thing was clear enough, and not a shadow of uneasiness or anything approaching it was in his mind. He slipped his ironical arms into the collecting box outside the church, and was amused to hear that they evoked no tinkle from within. "Quite a little windfall for those brown-gowned fellows. They'll buy another rosary," he said to himself, and soon, with the echo of his own steps following, he turned in at his gate. Once inside, he slipped behind a myrtle bush that stood at the edge of the gravel walk, to see if by chance anyone passed on the road outside. But nothing happened, and his theory of the echo, though it was odd that he should never have noticed it till so lately, seemed quite confirmed. From that night onwards he made it a practice, if he dined at the club, to walk home. Sometimes the step followed him, but not always, and this was an objection to that sensible echo theory. But the matter was no sort of worry to him, except sometimes when he woke in the night, and found that his brain, still drowsy and not in complete control, was brooding over it with an ever-increasing preoccupation. Often that misgiving faded away, and he dropped off to dreamless sleep again. Sometimes it was sufficiently disquieting to bring him broad awake, and then, with all his senses about him, it vanished. But there was this condition, halfway between waking and sleeping, when in the twilight chamber of his brain something listened, something feared. When fully awake, he no more thought of it than he thought of that frowsy Levantine tobacco merchant whom he had evicted and whose funeral he chanced to have seen. Early in December, his cousin and partner in the sugar business came down from Cairo to spend a week with him. Bill Cresswell may be succinctly described as a hot lot, and often after dinner at the club, he left his cousin to his cronies and the sedater pleasures of bridge, and went out with a duplicate latchkey in his pocket on livelier private affairs. One night, the last of Bill's sojourn here, there was nothing doing, and the two set forth together homewards from the club. "Nice night, let's walk," said John. "Nothing like a walk when there's liquid on board. Clears the brain for you, and I must have a final powwow tonight if you're off tomorrow. There are some bits of things still to go through." Bill acquiesced. The cafes were all closed. There was nothing very promising. "Nightlife here ain't a patch on Cairo," he observed. "Everyone seems to go to bed here just about when we begin to get going. Not but what I haven't enjoyed my stay with you. Capital good fellows at your club and brandy to match." He stopped and ruefully scanned the quiet and emptiness of the street. "Not a soul anywhere," he said. "Shutters up, all gone to bed. Nothing for it but a powwow, I guess." They walked on in silence for a while. Then behind them, firm and distinct to John's ears, there sprang up the sound of the footsteps, for which now he knew that he waited and listened. He wheeled round. "What's up?" asked Bill. "Curious thing," said John. "Night after night now, though not every night, when I walk home, I hear a step following me. I heard it then." Bill gave a vinous giggle. "No such luck for me," he said. "I like to hear a step following me about 1 of a morning. Something agreeable may come of it. Wish I could hear it." They walked on, and again, clearer than before, John heard what was inaudible to the other. He told himself, as he often did now, that it was an echo, but it was odd that the echo only repeated the footfalls of one of them. As he recognized this, he felt for the first time, when he was fully awake, some sudden chill of fear. It was as if a cold hand closed for a moment on his heart, just pressing it softly, almost tenderly. But they were now close to his own gate, and presently it clanged behind them. Bill returned next day to the gladder life of Cairo. John Cresswell saw him off at the station, and was passing out into the street again, through the crowd of loungers and porters and passengers, when there defined itself to his ear the sound of that footstep which he now knew so well. How he recognized it and isolated it from the tread of so many other feet, he had no idea. Simply his brain told him that it was following him again. He took a taxi to his office, and as he mounted the white stone stairs once more, it was on his track. Once more the gentle pressure of cold fingers seemed to assure him of the presence that, though invisible, was very close to him. And now it was as if those fingers were pressed on some bell push in his brain, and there sounded out a shrill tingle of fear. So hard-headed and sensible a man, of course, had nothing but scorn for all the claptrap bogey tales of spirits and ghosts and hauntings, and he would have welcomed any sort of apparition in which the step manifested itself, in order to have the pleasure of laughing in its face. He would have liked to see a skeleton or some shrouded figure stand close to him. He would have slashed at it with his stick and convinced himself that there was nothing there. Whatever his own eyes appeared to see could not be so unnerving as these tokens of the invisible. A stiff drink pulled him together again, and for the rest of the day there occurred no repetition of that tapping step which had begun to sprout with terror for him. In any case, he was determined to fight it, for he realized that it was chiefly his own fear that troubled him. No doubt he was suffering from some small nervous derangement. He had been working very hard, and after Christmas, if the thing continued to worry him, Probably he would see a doctor who would prescribe him some tonic or some sedative which would send the step into the limbo from which it had come. But it was more probable that his cure was in his own hands. His own resistance was all the medicine he needed. It was in pursuance of this very same policy that he set out that night after an evening at the club to walk home. He faced it just because he knew that some black well was digging itself into his soul. To yield, to take a taxi, was to retreat, and if he did that, if he gave way an inch, he guessed that he might be soon flying in panic before an invading an imaginary host of phantoms. He had no use for phantoms. The solid satisfactions of life were enough occupation. Once more, as he drew near the church, the steps sprang up, and now he sought no longer to tell himself it was an echo. Instead, he fixed his mind on it, saying to himself, "There it is, and it can't hurt me. Let it walk all day and night behind me if it chooses. It's got a fancy for me." Then his garden gate shut behind him, and with a sigh of relief he knew that he had passed out of its beat, for when once he was within, it never came farther. He stood for a moment on his threshold after he had opened his door, pleased with himself for having faced it. The bright light shone full onto the straight gravel walk he had just traversed. It was quite empty, and nothing was looking in through his gate. Then he heard from close at hand the crunch of the gravel underneath the heel of some invisible wayfarer. Now was the time to assert himself again, to look his fear in the eyes and mock at it. "Come along, whoever you are," he called, "and have a drink before you get back to hell. Something cooling. Drop of cold water, isn't it?" Thick sweat had broken out on his forehead, and his hand on the doorknob shook as with ague as he stood there looking out onto the bright, empty path. But he did not flinch from the lesson he was teaching himself. The seconds ticked away. He could count them from the pulse that hammered in his throat. "I'll give it 100 beats," he said to himself, "and then I'll say good night to Mr. Nothing at all." He counted his 100. He gave 10 beats more for good luck. "Good night, you old fraud," he said, and went in and secured the door. It seemed indeed for the week that followed that he had rightly gauged the nature of the hallucination, which had threatened to establish its awful dominion over him. Never once, whether by day or night, did there come to his ears that footfall which he feared and listened for, nor if in the dead hours of the darkness he lay for a while between sleep and waking, did he quake with a sense that something unseen and aware was watching him. A little courage, a flat denial of his fears had been sufficient not only to scotch them, but to snuff out the manifestation which had caused them. He kept his thoughts well in hand. He would not even conjecture what had been the cause of that visitation. Occasionally, while it still vexed him, he had cast about for the origin of it. He had wondered whether that shrill Levantine hag calling curses on him could somehow have found root in his mind. But now it was past and done with. He would have a few days' remission from work if it was overwork that had been at the bottom of it, at Christmas, and perhaps it would be prudent not to be quite so free with the club brandy. On Christmas Eve he and his friends sat at their bridge till close on midnight, then lingered over a drink, wished each other seasonable greetings, and dispersed. Cresswell hesitated as to whether he should not take a taxi home, for the object with which he had trudged back there so often seemed to be gained, and he no longer feared the recurrence of the step. But he thought he would just set the seal on his victory, and went on foot. He had come to the point in his walk where he had first heard the step. Tonight, as usual, there was none, and he stopped a moment, looking round him securely and serenely. It was a bright night, luminous with a moon a little after the full, and it amazed him to think that he had ever fashioned a terror to himself in this quiet, orderly street. From not far ahead there came the sound of the bells of the church saluting Christmas morning. They would have been holding their midnight mass there. He breathed the night air with content, and throwing the butt of his spent cigar into the roadway, he walked on again. With a sudden sinking of his heart, he heard behind him the step which he thought he had silenced forever. It was faint at first, but tonight, instead of keeping at a uniform distance behind him, It was approaching. Louder and more crisp it sounded, until it was close to him. On and on it came, still gaining on him, and now there brushed by him, though not quite touching him, the figure of a man in European dress, with his head wrapped in a shawl. "Hello, you there," called Cresswell. "You're the skunk who's been following me, are you? And slipping out of sight again? No more of your damn conjuring tricks. Let's have a look at you." The figure, now some 2 or 3 yards ahead of him, stopped at the sound of his voice and turned around. The shawl covered its face, but for a narrow chink between the edges. "So you understand English," said Cresswell. "Now I'll thank you to take that shawl off your face, and let me see who it is that's been dogging me." The man raised his hands and threw back the shawl. The moonlight shone on his face, and that face was just a slab of smooth yellowish flesh, extending from ear to ear, empty as the oval of an egg without eyes or nose or mouth. From the upper edge of the shawl where it crossed the forehead, there depended a few wisps of grey hair. Cresswell looked, and a wave of panic fear submerged his very soul. He gave a little thin squeal and started to run, listening the while in an agony of terror to hear if the steps of that nameless, faceless creature were following. He must run, to get away from that thing out of hell which had manifested itself. Then, close at hand, he saw the lights of the church, and there perhaps he could find sanctuary from it. The door was open and he sprang up the steps. Close by there were lights burning on the altar of a side chapel, and he flung himself on his knees. Not for years had he attempted to pray, and now in the agony of his soul he could but say in a gabbling whisper, "Oh my God, oh my God." Over and over he said it. By degrees some sort of self-control came back to him. There were holy images, there was a sacred picture above the altar, a smell of hallowing incense was in the air. Surely there was protection here, a power that would intervene between him and the terror of that face. A sort of tranquillity overscored his panic, and he began to look round. The church was darker than it had been when he entered, and he saw that some of those cowled, brown-habited men of the order were moving quietly about, quenching the lights. Those at the altar in front of which he knelt were still bright, and now he saw one of these cowled figures move up close to him, as if waiting for him to finish his devotions. He was calm now, his panic had quite passed, and he rose from his knees. "I've had a terrible fright, Father," he said to the monk. "I saw something just now out in the street which must have come out of hell." The figure turned a little towards him. The cowl concealed its face altogether, and the voice came muffled. "Indeed, my son," he said. "Tell me what it is that frightened you." Cresswell felt some backwash of his panic returning. "A man passed me as I was going back to my house," he said, "and I told him to stop and let me have a look at him. He wore a shawl over his head and he threw it back. Oh my God, that face!" The monk quietly raised his hands and grasped the edges of his cowl. Then, with a quick movement, he threw it back. "That sort of face," he said. The end. Mr. Justice Harbottle by J.Sheridan Le Fanu and read by Christopher Holton. 30 years ago, an elderly man to whom I paid quarterly a small annuity charged on some property of mine came on the quarter day to receive it. He was a dry, sad, quiet man who had known better days and had always maintained an unexceptionable character. No better authority could be imagined for a ghost story. He told me one, though with a manifest reluctance. He was drawn into the narration by his choosing to explain what I should not have remarked, that he had called 2 days earlier than that week after the strict day of payment which he had usually allowed to elapse. His reason was a sudden determination to change his lodgings, and the consequent necessity of paying his rent a little before it was due. He lodged in a dark street in Westminster, in a spacious old house, very warm, being wainscoted from top to bottom, and furnished with no undue abundance of windows, and those fitted with thick sashes and small panes. This house was, as the bills upon the windows testified, offered to be sold or let, but no one seemed to care to look at it. A thin matron in rusty black silk, very taciturn, with large, steady, alarmed eyes that seemed to look in your face, to read what you might have seen in the dark rooms and passages through which you had passed, was in charge of it, with a solitary maid-of-all-work under her command. My poor friend had taken lodgings in this house on account of their extraordinary cheapness. He had occupied them for nearly a year without the slightest disturbance, and was the only tenant under rent in the house. He had 2 rooms, a sitting room and a bedroom with a closet opening from it, in which he kept his books and papers locked up. He had gone to his bed, having also locked the outer door. Unable to sleep, he had lighted a candle, and after having read for a time, had laid the book beside him. He heard the old clock at the stairhead strike 1, and very shortly after, to his alarm, he saw the closet door, which he thought he had locked, open stealthily, and a slight dark man, particularly sinister, and somewhere about 50, dressed in mourning of a very antique fashion, such a suit as we see in Hogarth, entered the room on tiptoe. He was followed by an elder man, stout and blotched with scurvy, and whose features, fixed as a corpse's, were stamped with dreadful force with a character of sensuality and villainy. This old man wore a flowered silk dressing gown and ruffles, and he remarked a gold ring on his finger, and on his head a cap of velvet, such as, in the days of perukes, gentlemen wore in undress. This direful old man carried in his ringed and ruffled hand a coil of rope, and these 2 figures crossed the floor diagonally, passing the foot of his bed from the closet door at the farther end of the room, at the left near the window, to the door opening upon the lobby, close to the bed's head at his right. He did not attempt to describe his sensations as these figures passed so near him. He merely said that so far from sleeping in that room again, no consideration the world could offer would induce him so much as to enter it again alone, even in the daylight. He found both doors, that of the closet and that of the room opening upon the lobby, in the morning fast locked as he had left them before going to bed. In answer to a question of mine, he said that neither appeared the least conscious of his presence. They did not seem to glide, but walked as living men do, but without any sound, and he felt a vibration on the floor as they crossed it. He so obviously suffered from speaking about the apparitions that I asked him no more questions. There were in his description, however, certain coincidences so very singular as to induce me by that very post to write to a friend much my senior, then living in a remote part of England, for the information which I knew he could give me. He had himself more than once pointed out that old house to my attention, and told me, though very briefly, the strange story which I now asked him to give me in greater detail. His answer satisfied me, and the following pages convey its substance. "Your letter," he wrote, "tells me you desire some particulars about the closing years of the life of Mr. Justice Harbottle, one of the judges of the Court of Common Pleas. You refer, of course, to the extraordinary occurrences that made that period of his life long after a theme for winter tales and metaphysical speculation. I happen to know perhaps more than any other man living of those mysterious particulars. The old family mansion, when I revisited London more than 30 years ago, I examined for the last time. During the years that have passed since then, I hear that improvement, with its preliminary demolitions, has been doing wonders for the quarter of Westminster in which it stood. If I were quite certain that the house had been taken down, I should have no difficulty about naming the street in which it stood. As what I have to tell, however, is not likely to improve its letting value, and as I should not care to get into trouble, I prefer being silent on that particular point. How old the house was, I can't tell. People said it was built by Roger Harbottle, a Turkey merchant, in the reign of King James I. I am not a good opinion upon such questions, but having been in it, though in its forlorn and deserted state, I can tell you in a general way what it was like. It was built of dark red brick, and the door and windows were faced with stone that had turned yellow by time. It receded some feet from the line of the other houses in the street, and it had a florid and fanciful rail of iron about the broad steps that invited your ascent to the hall door, in which were fixed, under a file of lamps among scrolls and twisted leaves, two immense extinguishers, like the conical caps of fairies, into which in old times the footmen used to thrust their flambeaux, when their chairs or coaches had set down their great people, in the hall or at the steps as the case might be. That hall is panelled up to the ceiling and has a large fireplace. 2 or 3 stately old rooms open from it at each side. The windows of these are tall, with many small panes. Passing through the arch at the back of the hall, you come upon the wide and heavy well staircase. There is a back staircase also. The mansion is large and has not as much light by any means in proportion to its extent as modern houses enjoy. When I saw it, it had long been untenanted and had the gloomy reputation beside of a haunted house. Cobwebs floated from the ceilings or spanned the corners of the cornices, and dust lay thick over everything. The windows were stained with the dust and rain of 50 years, and darkness had thus grown darker. When I made it my first visit, it was in company with my father when I was still a boy, in the year 1808. I was about 12 years old, and my imagination impressible, as it always is at that age. I looked about me with great awe. I was here in the very centre and scene of those occurrences which I had heard recounted at the fireside at home with so delightful a horror. My father was an old bachelor of nearly 60 when he married. He had, when a child, seen Judge Harbottle on the bench in his robes and wig a dozen times at least before his death, which took place in 1748, and his appearance made a powerful and unpleasant impression not only on his imagination, but upon his nerves. The judge was at that time a man of some 67 years. He had a great mulberry-coloured face, a big carbuncled nose, fierce eyes, and a grim and brutal mouth. My father, who was young at the time, thought it the most formidable face he had ever seen, for there were evidences of intellectual power in the formation and lines of the forehead. His voice was loud and harsh, and gave effect to the sarcasm which was his habitual weapon on the bench. This old gentleman had the reputation of being about the wickedest man in England. Even on the bench, he now and then showed his scorn of opinion. He had carried cases his own way, it was said, in spite of council, authorities, and even of juries, by a sort of cajolery, violence, and bamboozling that somehow confused and overpowered resistance. He had never actually committed himself. He was too cunning to do that. He had the character of being, however, a dangerous and unscrupulous judge, but his character did not trouble him. The associates he chose for his hours of relaxation cared as little as he did about it. One night during the session of 1746, this old judge went down in his chair to wait in one of the rooms of the House of Lords for the result of a division in which he and his order were interested. This over, he was about to return to his house close by in his chair, but the night had become so soft and fine that he changed his mind, sent it home empty, and with 2 footmen, each with a flambeau, set out on foot in preference. Gout had made him rather a slow pedestrian. It took him some time to get through the 2 or 3 streets he had to pass before reaching his house. In one of those narrow streets of tall houses, perfectly silent at that hour, he overtook, slowly as he was walking, a very singular-looking old gentleman. He had a bottle-green coat on with a cape to it and large stone buttons, a broad-leafed low-crowned hat from under which a big powdered wig escaped. He stooped very much and supported his bending knees with the aid of a crutch-handled cane, and so shuffled and tottered along painfully. "I ask your pardon, sir," said this old man in a very quavering voice, as the burly judge came up with him, and he extended his hand feebly towards his arm. Mr. Justice Harbottle saw that the man was by no means poorly dressed, and his manner that of a gentleman. The judge stopped short and said in his harsh, peremptory tones, "Well, sir, how can I serve you?" Can you direct me to Judge Harbottle's house? I have some intelligence of the very last importance to communicate to him." "Can you tell it before witnesses?" asked the judge. "By no means. It must reach his ear only," quavered the old man earnestly. "If that be so, sir, you have only to accompany me a few steps farther to reach my house and obtain a private audience, for I am Judge Harbottle." With this invitation the infirm gentleman in the white wig complied very readily, and in another minute the stranger stood in what was then termed the front parlour of the judge's house, tête-à-tête with that shrewd and dangerous functionary. He had to sit down, being very much exhausted and unable for a little time to speak, and then he had a fit of coughing, and after that a fit of gasping, and thus 2 or 3 minutes passed, during which the judge dropped his roquelaure on an armchair and threw his cocked hat over that. The venerable pedestrian in the white wig quickly recovered his voice. With closed doors they remained together for some time. There were guests waiting in the drawing-rooms, and the sound of men's voices laughing, and then of a female voice singing to a harpsichord, were heard distinctly in the hall over the stairs, for old Judge Harbottle had arranged one of his dubious jollifications, such as might well make the hair of godly men's heads stand upright for that night. This old gentleman in the powdered white wig that rested on his stooped shoulders must have had something to say that interested the judge very much, for he would not have parted on easy terms with the 10 minutes and upwards which that conference filched from the sort of revelry in which he most delighted, and in which he was the roaring king, and in some sort the tyrant also of his company. The footman who showed the aged gentleman out observed that the judge's mulberry-coloured face, pimples and all, were bleached to a dingy yellow, and there was the abstraction of agitated thought in his manner as he bid the stranger good night. The servant saw that the conversation had been of serious import, and that the judge was frightened. Instead of stumping upstairs forthwith to his scandalous hilarities, his profane company, and his great china bowl of punch, the identical bowl from which a bygone Bishop of London, good easy man, had baptized this judge's grandfather, now clinking round the rim with silver ladles, and hung with scrolls of lemon peel. Instead, I say, of stumping and clambering up the great staircase to the cavern of his Circean enchantment, he stood with his big nose flattened against the window-pane, watching the progress of the feeble old man, who clung stiffly to the iron rail as he got down, step by step, to the pavement. The hall door had hardly closed when the old judge was in the hall bawling hasty orders, with such stimulating expletives as old colonels under excitement sometimes indulge in nowadays, with a stamp or two of his big foot, and a waving of his clenched fist in the air. He commanded the footman to overtake the old gentleman in the white wig, to offer him his protection on his way home, and in no case to show his face again without having ascertained where he lodged, and who he was, and all about him. "By sirrah, if you fail me in this, you doff my livery tonight." Forth bounced the stalwart footman with his heavy cane under his arm, and skipped down the steps, and looked up and down the street after the singular figure so easy to recognize. What were his adventures I shall not tell you just now. The old man, in the conference to which he had been admitted in that stately panelled room, had just told the judge a very strange story. He might be himself a conspirator, he might possibly be crazed, or possibly his whole story was straight and true. The aged gentleman in the bottle-green coat, in finding himself alone with Mr. Justice Harbottle, had become agitated. He said, "There is, perhaps you are not aware, my lord, a prisoner in Shrewsbury jail, charged with having forged a bill of exchange for £120, and his name is Lewis Pineweck, a grocer of that town." "Is there?" says the judge, who knew well that there was. "Yes, my lord," says the old man. "Then you had better say nothing to affect this case. If you do, by God, I'll commit you, for I'm to try it," says the judge, with his terrible look and tone. "I am not going to do anything of the kind, my lord. Of him or his case I know nothing, and care nothing. but a fact has come to my knowledge, which it behoves you to well consider." "And what may that fact be?" inquired the judge. "I'm in haste, sir, and beg you will use dispatch." "It has come to my knowledge, my lord, that a secret tribunal is in process of formation, the object of which is to take cognizance of the conduct of the judges, and first of your conduct, my lord. It is a wicked conspiracy." "Who are of it?" demands the judge. "I know not a single name as yet." "I know, but the fact, my lord, it is most certainly true." "I'll have you before the Privy Council, sir," says the judge. "That is what I most desire, but not for a day or two, my lord." "And why so?" "I have not as yet a single name, as I told your lordship, but I expect to have a list of the most forward men in it, and some other papers connected with the plot in 2 or 3 days." "You said 1 or 2 just now." "About that time, my lord. Is this a Jacobite plot?" "In the main, I think it is, my lord." "Why then, it is political. I have tried no state prisoners, nor am like to try any such. How then doth it concern me?" "From what I can gather, my lord, there are those in it who desire private revenges upon certain judges." "What do they call their cabal?" "The High Court of Appeal, my lord." "Who are you, sir? What is your name?" "Hugh Peters, my lord." "That should be a Whig name." "It is, my lord." "Where do you lodge, Mr. Peters?" "In Thames Street, my lord, over against the sign of the 3 Kings." 3 Kings? Take care one be not too many for you, Mr. Peters. How come you, an honest Whig as you say, to be privy to a Jacobite plot? Answer me that." "My lord, a person in whom I take an interest has been seduced to take a part in it, and being frightened at the unexpected wickedness of their plans, he is resolved to become an informer for the crown." "He resolves like a wise man, sir. What does he say of the persons who are in the plot? Doth he know them?" "Only 2, my lord, but he will be introduced to the club in a few days, and he will then have a list and more exact information of their plans, and above all of their oaths, and their hours and places of meeting, with which he wishes to be acquainted before they can have any suspicions of his intentions. And being so informed, to whom, think you, my lord, had he best go then?" "To the King's Attorney General straight, but you say this concerns me, sir, in particular. How about this prisoner, Lewis Pineweck? Is he one of them?" "I can't tell, my lord, but for some reason it is thought your lordship will be well advised if you try him not. For if you do, it is feared 'twill shorten your days." "So far as I can learn, Mr. Peters, this business smells pretty strong of blood and treason. The King's Attorney General will know how to deal with it. When shall I see you again, sir?" "If you give me leave, my lord, either before your lordship's court sits or after it rises tomorrow. I should like to come and tell your lordship what has passed." "Do so, Mr. Peters, at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and see you play me no trick, sir, in this matter. If you do, by God, sir, I'll lay you by the heels." "You need fear no trick from me, my lord. Had I not wished to serve you and acquit my own conscience, I never would have come all this way to talk with your lordship." "I'm willing to believe you, Mr. Peters. I'm willing to believe you, sir." And upon this they parted. He has either painted his face, or he is consumedly sick, thought the old judge. The light had shone more effectually upon his features as he turned to leave the room with a low bow, and they looked, he fancied, unnaturally chalky. "Damn him," said the judge ungraciously as he began to scale the stairs. "He has half spoiled my supper." But if he had, no one but the judge himself perceived it, and the evidence was all as anyone might perceive the other way. In the meantime, the footman dispatched in pursuit of Mr. Peters speedily overtook that feeble gentleman. The old man stopped when he heard the sound of pursuing steps, but any alarms that may have crossed his mind seemed to disappear on his recognizing the livery. He very gratefully accepted the proffered assistance, and placed his tremulous arm within the servant's for support. They had not gone far, however, when the old man stopped suddenly, saying, Dear me, as I live, I have dropped it. You heard it fall. My eyes, I fear, won't serve me, and I'm unable to stoop low enough. But if you will look, you shall have half the find. It is a guinea. I carried it in my glove." The street was silent and deserted. The footman had hardly descended to what he termed his hunkers, and begun to search the pavement about the spot which the old man indicated, when Mr. Peters, who seemed very much exhausted, and breathed with difficulty, struck him a violent blow from above, over the back of the head with a heavy instrument, and then another, and leaving him bleeding and senseless in the gutter, ran like a lamplighter down a lane to the right, and was gone. When an hour later the watchman brought the man in livery home, still stupid and covered with blood, Judge Harbottle cursed his servant roundly, swore he was drunk, threatened him with an indictment for taking bribes to betray his master, and cheered him with a perspective of the broad street leading from the Old Bailey to Tyburn, the cart's tail, and the hangman's lash. Notwithstanding this demonstration, the judge was pleased. It was a disguised affidavit man or footpad, no doubt, who had been employed to frighten him. The trick had fallen through. A court of appeal, such as the false Hugh Peters had indicated, with assassination for its sanction, would be an uncomfortable institution for a hanging judge like the Honourable Justice Harbottle, that sarcastic and ferocious administrator of the Criminal Code of England, at that time a rather pharisaical, bloody and heinous system of justice, had reasons of his own for choosing to try that very Lewis Pineweck, on whose behalf this audacious trick was devised. Try him he would. No man living should take that morsel out of his mouth. Of Lewis Pineweck, of course, so far as the outer world could see, he knew nothing. He would try him after his fashion, without fear, favour or affection. But did he not remember a certain thin man, dressed in mourning, in whose house in Shrewsbury the judge's lodgings used to be, until a scandal of ill-treating his wife came suddenly to light? A grocer with a demure look, a soft step, and a lean face as dark as mahogany, with a nose sharp and long, standing ever so little awry, and a pair of dark steady brown eyes under thinly traced black brows. A man whose thin lips wore always a faint unpleasant smile. Had not that scoundrel an account to settle with the judge? Had he not been troublesome lately? And was not his name Lewis Pineweck, sometime grocer in Shrewsbury, and now prisoner in the jail of that town? The reader may take it, if he pleases, as a sign that Judge Harbottle was a good Christian, that he suffered nothing ever from remorse. That was undoubtedly true. He had, nevertheless, done this grocer, forger, what you will, some 5 or 6 years before, a grievous wrong. But it was not that, but a possible scandal and possible complications that troubled the learned judge now. Did he not, as a lawyer, know that to bring a man from his shop to the dock, the chances must be at least 99 out of 100 that he is guilty? A weak man like his learned brother Withershins was not a judge to keep the high road safe and make crime tremble. Old Judge Harbottle was the man to make the evil-disposed quiver, and to refresh the world with showers of wicked blood, and thus save the innocent to the refrain of the ancient saw he loved to quote, "Foolish pity ruins a city." In hanging that fellow he could not be wrong. The eye of a man accustomed to look upon the dock could not fail to read villain written sharp and clear in his plotting face. Of course he would try him, and no one else should. A saucy-looking woman, still handsome, in a mob cap gay with blue ribbons, in a sack of flowered silk, with lace and rings on, much too fine for the judge's housekeeper, which nevertheless she was, peeped into his study next morning, and, seeing the judge alone, stepped in. "Here's another letter from him, come by the post this morning. Can't you do nothing for him?" she said wheedlingly, with her arm over his neck, and her delicate finger and thumb fiddling with the lobe of his purple ear. "I'll try," said Judge Harbottle, not raising his eyes from the paper he was reading. "I knew you'd do what I asked you," she said. The judge clapped his gouty claw over his heart and made her an ironical bow. "What?" she asked. "Will you do?" "Hang him," said the judge with a chuckle. "You don't mean to. No, you don't, my little man," said she, surveying herself in a mirror on the wall. "I'm damned, but I think you're falling in love with your husband at last," said Judge Harbottle. "I'm blessed, but I think you're growing jealous of him," replied the lady with a laugh. "But no, he was always a bad one to me. I've done with him long ago." "And he with you, by George. When he took your fortune and your spoons and your earrings, he had all he wanted of you. He drove you from his house, and when he discovered you had made yourself comfortable and found a good situation, he'd have taken your guineas and your silver and your earrings over again, and then allowed you 6 years more to make a new harvest for his mill. You don't wish him good. If you say you do, you lie." She laughed a wicked, saucy laugh and gave the terrible Rhadamanthus a playful tap on the chops. "He wants me to send him money to fee a counsellor," she said, while her eyes wandered over the pictures on the wall and back again to the looking-glass, and certainly she did not look as if his jeopardy troubled her very much. "Confound his impudence, the scoundrel!" thundered the old judge, throwing himself back in his chair, as he used to do in furore on the bench, and the lines of his mouth looked brutal, and his eyes ready to leap from their sockets. "If you answer his letter from my house to please yourself, you'll write your next from somebody else's to please me. You understand, my pretty witch, I'll not be pestered. Come, no pouting, whimpering won't do. You don't care a brass farthing for the villain, body or soul. You came here but to make a row. You are one of Mother Carey's chickens, and where you come, the storm is up. Get you gone, baggage, get you gone," he repeated with a stamp, for a knock at the hall door made her instantaneous disappearance indispensable. I need hardly say that the venerable Hugh Peters did not appear again. The judge never mentioned him, but oddly enough, considering how he laughed to scorn the weak invention which he had blown into dust at the very first puff, his white-wig visitor and the conference in the dark front parlour were often in his memory. His shrewd eye told him that, allowing for change of tints and such disguises as the playhouse affords every night, the features of this false old man, who had turned out too hard for his tall footman, were identical with those of Lewis Pineweck. Judge Harbottle made his registrar call upon the Crown Solicitor and tell him that there was a man in town who bore a wonderful resemblance to a prisoner in Shrewsbury jail named Lewis Pineweck, and to make inquiry through the post forthwith whether anyone was personating Pineweck in prison, and whether he had thus or otherwise made his escape. The prisoner was safe, however, and no question as to his identity. In due time, Judge Harbottle went circuit, and in due time the judges were in Shrewsbury. News travelled slowly in those days, and newspapers, like the wagons and stagecoaches, took matters easily. Mrs. Pineweck in the judge's house, with a diminished household, the greater part of the judge's servants having gone with him, for he had given up riding circuit and travelled in his coach in state, kept house rather solitarily at home. In spite of quarrels, in spite of mutual injuries, some of them inflicted by herself, enormous, in spite of a married life of spited bickerings, a life in which there seemed no love or liking or forbearance, for years, now that Pineweck stood in near danger of death, something like remorse came suddenly upon her. She knew that in Shrewsbury were transacting the scenes which were to determine his fate. She knew she did not love him, but she could not have supposed even a fortnight before that the hour of suspense could have affected her so powerfully. She knew the day on which the trial was expected to take place. She could not get it out of her head for a minute. She felt faint as it drew towards evening. 2 or 3 days passed, and then she knew that the trial must be over by this time. There were floods between London and Shrewsbury, and news was long delayed. She wished the floods would last forever. It was dreadful waiting to hear, dreadful to know that the event was over, and that she could not hear till self-willed rivers subsided, dreadful to know that they must subside and the news come at last. She had some vague trust in the judge's good nature and much in the resources of chance and accident. She had contrived to send the money he wanted. He would not be without legal advice and energetic and skilled support. At last the news did come, a long arrear all in a gush, a letter from a female friend in Shrewsbury, a return of the sentences sent up for the judge, and most important because most easily got at, being told with great aplomb and brevity, the long-deferred intelligence of the Shrewsbury Assizes in the Morning Advertiser. Like an impatient reader of a novel who reads the last page first, she read with dizzy eyes the list of the executions. 2 were respited, 7 were hanged, and in that capital catalogue was this line, Lewis Pineweck forgery. She had to read it half a dozen times over before she was sure she understood it. Here was the paragraph. Sentence death, 7. Executed accordingly on Friday the 13th instant, to wit, Thomas Primer alias Duck, highway robbery, Flora Guy. Stealing to the value of 11 shillings and sixpence. Arthur Poundon, burglary, Matilda Mummery, riot, Lewis Pineweck, forgery, bill of exchange. And when she reached this, she read it over and over, feeling very cold and sick. This buxom housekeeper was known in the house as Mrs. Carwell, Carwell being her maiden name, which she had resumed. No one in the house except its master knew her history. Her introduction had been managed craftily. No one suspected that it had been concerted between her and the old reprobate in scarlet and ermine. Flora Carwell ran up the stairs now, and snatched her little girl, hardly 7 years of age, whom she met on the lobby, hurriedly up in her arms, and carried her into her bedroom, without well knowing what she was doing, and sat down, placing the child before her. She was not able to speak. She held the child before her, and looked in the little girl's wondering face, and burst into tears of horror. She thought the judge could have saved him. I dare say he could. For a time she was furious with him, and hugged and kissed her bewildered little girl, who returned her gaze with large round eyes. That little girl had lost her father and knew nothing of the matter. She had always been told that her father was dead long ago. A woman, coarse, uneducated, vain and violent, does not reason or even feel very distinctly, but in these tears of consternation were mingling a self-upbraiding. She felt afraid of that little child. But Mrs. Carwell was a person who lived not upon sentiment but upon beef and pudding. She consoled herself with punch. She did not trouble herself long even with resentments. She was a gross and material person, and could not mourn over the irrevocable for more than a limited number of hours, even if she would. Judge Harbottle was soon in London again. Except the gout, this savage old Epicurean never knew a day's sickness. He laughed and coaxed and bullied away the young woman's faint upbraidings, and in a little time Lewis Pineweck troubled her no more, and the judge secretly chuckled over the perfectly fair removal of a bore, who might have grown little by little into something very like a tyrant. It was the lot of the judge, whose adventures I am now recounting, to try criminal cases at the Old Bailey shortly after his return. He had commenced his charge to the jury in a case of forgery, and was, after his wont, thundering dead against the prisoner, with many a hard aggravation and cynical jibe, when suddenly all died away in silence, and instead of looking at the jury, the eloquent judge was gaping at some person in the body of the court. Among the persons of small importance who stand and listen at the sides was one tall enough to show with a little prominence, a slight mean figure dressed in seedy black, lean and dark of visage. He had just handed a letter to the crier before he caught the judge's eye. The judge described to his amazement the features of Lewis Pineweck. He had the usual faint, thin-lipped smile, and with his blue chin raised in air, and as it seemed quite unconscious of the distinguished notice he has attracted, he was stretching his low cravat with his crooked fingers, while he slowly turned his head from side to side, a process which enabled the judge to see distinctly a stripe of swollen blue round his neck, which indicated, he thought, the grip of the rope. This man, with a few others, had got a footing on a step from which he could better see the court. He now stepped down, and the judge lost sight of him. His lordship signed energetically with his hand in the direction in which this man had vanished. He turned to the tipstaff. His first effort to speak ended in a gasp. He cleared his throat and told the astounded official to arrest that man who had interrupted the court. "He's but this moment gone down there. Bring him in custody before me within 10 minutes' time, or I'll strip your gown from your shoulders and fine the sheriff," he thundered, while his eyes flashed round the court in search of the functionary. Attorneys, counsellors, idle spectators gazed in the direction in which Mr. Justice Harbottle had shaken his gnarled old hand. They compared notes. Not one had seen anyone making a disturbance. They asked one another if the judge was losing his head. Nothing came of the search. His lordship concluded his charge a great deal more tamely, and when the jury retired, he stared round the court with a wandering mind, and looked as if he would not have given sixpence to see the prisoner hanged. The judge had received the letter. Had he known from whom it came, he would no doubt have read it instantaneously. As it was, he simply read the direction, "To the Honourable the Lord Justice, Elijah Harbottle, one of His Majesty's Justices of the Honourable Court of Common Pleas." It remained forgotten in his pocket till he reached home. When he pulled out that and others from the capacious pocket of his coat, it had its turn as he sat in his library in his thick silk dressing-gown, and then he found its contents to be a closely written letter in a clerk's hand, and an enclosure in secretary hand, as I believe the angular scrivenery of law writings in those days was termed, engrossed on a bit of parchment about the size of this page. The letter said, "Mr. Justice Harbottle, my lord, I am ordered by the High Court of Appeal to acquaint your lordship, in order to your better preparing yourself for your trial, that a true bill hath been sent down, and the indictment lieth against your lordship for the murder of one Lewis Pinewick of Shrewsbury, a citizen wrongfully executed for the forgery of a bill of exchange on the blank day of blank last, by reason of the wilful perversion of the evidence, and the undue pressure put upon the jury, together with the illegal admission of evidence by your lordship, well knowing the same to be illegal, by all which the promoter of the prosecution of the said indictment before the High Court of Appeal hath lost his life. And the trial of the said indictment, I am farther ordered to acquaint your lordship, is fixed for the both day of blank next ensuing, by the Right Honourable the Lord Chief Justice Twofold of the court aforesaid, to wit, the High Court of Appeal, on which day it will most certainly take place. And I am farther to acquaint your lordship, to prevent any surprise or miscarriage, that your case stands first for the said day, and that the said High Court of Appeal sits day and night, and never rises. And herewith, by order of the said court, I furnish your lordship with a copy, extract, of the record in this case, except of the indictment, whereof notwithstanding the substance and effect is supplied to your lordship in this notice. And farther I am to inform you that in case the jury then to try your lordship should find you guilty, the Right Honourable the Lord Chief Justice will, in passing sentence of death upon you, fix the day of execution for the 10th day of blank, being 1 calendar month from the day of your trial. It was signed by Caleb Searcher, officer of the Crown Solicitor in the Kingdom of Life and Death. The judge glanced through the parchment. "Splud! Do they think a man like me is to be bamboozled by their buffoonery?" The judge's coarse features were wrung into one of his sneers, but he was pale. Possibly, after all, there was a conspiracy on foot. It was queer. Did they mean to pistol him in his carriage, or did they only aim at frightening him? Judge Harbottle had more than enough of animal courage. He was not afraid of highwaymen, and he had fought more than his share of duels, being a foul-mouthed advocate while he held briefs at the bar. No one questioned his fighting qualities, but with respect to this particular case of Pinewick, he lived in a house of glass. Was there not his pretty, dark-eyed, overdressed housekeeper, Mrs. Flora Carwell? Very easy for people who knew Shrewsbury to identify Mrs. Pineweck if once put upon the scent. And had he not stormed and worked hard in that case? Had he not made it hard sailing for the prisoner? Did he not know very well what the bar thought of it? It would be the worst scandal that ever blasted Judge. So much there was intimidating in the matter, but nothing more. The Judge was a little bit gloomy for a day or two after, and more testy with everyone than usual. He locked up the papers, and about a week after he asked his housekeeper one day in the library, "Had your husband never a brother?" Mrs. Carwell squalled on this sudden introduction of the funereal topic, and cried exemplary piggins full, as the Judge used pleasantly to say. But he was in no mood for trifling now, and he said sternly, "Come, madam, this wearies me. Do it another time, and give me an answer to my question." So she did. Pineweck had no brother living. He once had one, but he died in Jamaica. "How do you know he is dead?" asked the Judge. "Because he told me so." "Not the dead man." "Pineweck told me so. Is that all?" sneered the Judge. He pondered this matter, and time went on. The Judge was growing a little morose and less enjoying. The subject struck nearer to his thoughts than he fancied it could have done. But so it is with most undivulged vexations, and there was no one to whom he could tell this one. It was now the 9th, and Mr. Justice Harbottle was glad. He knew nothing would come of it. Still it bothered him, and tomorrow would see it well over. What of the paper I have cited? No one saw it during his life, no one after his death. He spoke of it to Dr. Headstone, and what purported to be a copy in the old Judge's handwriting was found. The original was nowhere. Was it a copy of an illusion? Incident to brain disease? Such is my belief. Judge Harbottle went this night to the play at Drury Lane. He was one of the old fellows who care nothing for late hours and occasional knocking about in pursuit of pleasure. He had appointed with 2 cronies of Lincoln's Inn to come home in his coach with him to sup after the play. They were not in his box, but were to meet him near the entrance and get into his carriage there, and Mr. Justice Harbottle, who hated waiting, was looking a little impatiently from the window. The Judge yawned. He told the footman to watch for Councillor Thavies and Councillor Bella, who were coming, and with another yawn he laid his cocked hat on his knees, closed his eyes, leaned back in his corner, wrapped his mantle closer about him, and began to think of pretty Mrs. Abington. And being a man who could sleep like a sailor at a moment's notice, he was thinking of taking a nap. Those fellows had no business to keep a judge waiting. He heard their voices now. Those rake-hell councillors were laughing and bantering and sparring after their wont. The carriage swayed and jerked as one got in, and then again as the other followed. The door clapped, and the coach was now jogging and rumbling over the pavement. The judge was a little bit sulky. He did not care to sit up and open his eyes. Let them suppose he was asleep. He heard them laugh with more malice than good humour, he thought, as they observed it. He would give them a damned hard knock or two when they got to his door, and till then he would counterfeit his nap. The clocks were chiming 12. Bella and Thavies were silent as tombstones. They were generally loquacious and merry rascals. The judge suddenly felt himself roughly seized and thrust from his corner into the middle of the seat, and opening his eyes, instantly he found himself between his 2 companions. Before he could blurt out the oath that was at his lips, he saw that they were 2 strangers, evil-looking fellows, each with a pistol in his hand, and dressed like Bow Street officers. The judge clutched at the check-string. The coach pulled up. He stared about him. They were not among houses, but through the windows, under a broad moonlight, he saw a black moor stretching lifelessly from right to left with rotting trees, pointing fantastic branches in the air, standing here and there in groups, as if they held up their arms and twigs like fingers, in horrible glee at the judge's coming. A footman came to the window. He knew his long face and sunken eyes. He knew it was Dingley Chuff 15 years ago, a footman in his service, whom he had turned off at a moment's notice, in a burst of jealousy, and indicted for a missing spoon. The man had died in prison of the jail fever. The judge drew back in utter amazement. His armed companions signed mutely, and they were again gliding over this unknown moor. The bloated and gouty old man, in his horror, considered the question of resistance, but his athletic days were long over. This moor was a desert, there was no help to be had. He was in the hands of strange servants, even if his recognition turned out to be a delusion, and they were under the command of his captors. There was nothing for it but submission for the present. Suddenly the coach was brought nearly to a standstill, so that the prisoner saw an ominous sight from the window. It was a gigantic gallows beside the road. It stood three-sided, and from each of its three broad beams at top depended in chains some 8 or 10 bodies, from several of which the cereclothes had dropped away, leaving the skeletons swinging lightly by their chains. A tall ladder reached to the summit of the structure, and on the peat beneath lay bones. On top of the dark transverse beam facing the road, from which, as from the other two completing the triangle of death, dangled a row of these unfortunates in chains, a hangman with a pipe in his mouth, much as we see him in the famous print of The Idle Apprentice, though here his perch was ever so much higher, was reclining at his ease and listlessly shying bones, from a little heap at his elbow, at the skeletons that hung round, bringing down now a rib or two, now a hand, now half a leg. A long-sighted man could have discerned that he was a dark fellow, lean, and from continually looking down on the earth from the elevation over which, in another sense, he always hung, his nose, his lips, his chin, were pendulous and loose, and drawn down into a monstrous grotesque. This fellow took his pipe from his mouth on seeing the coach, stood up and cut some solemn capers high on his beam, and shook a new rope in the air, crying with a voice high and distant as the caw of a raven hovering over a gibbet, "A robe for Judge Harbottle." The coach was now driving on at its old swift pace. So high a gallows as that the judge had never, even in his most hilarious moments, dreamed of. He thought he must be raving. And the dead footman! He shook his ears and strained his eyelids, but if he was dreaming, he was unable to awake himself. There was no good in threatening these scoundrels. A brutum foolman might bring a real one on his head. Any submission to get out of their hands, and then heaven and earth he would move to unearth and hunt them down. Suddenly they drove round a corner of a vast white building and under a porte-cochere. The judge found himself in a corridor lighted with dingy oil lamps, the walls of bare stone. It looked like a passage in a prison. His guards placed him in the hands of other people. Here and there he saw bony and gigantic soldiers passing to and fro with muskets over their shoulders. They looked straight before them, grinding their teeth in bleak fury, with no noise but the clank of their shoes. He saw these by glimpses, round corners and at the ends of passages, but he did not actually pass them by. And now, passing under a narrow doorway, he found himself in the dock, confronting a judge in his scarlet robes, in a large courthouse. There was nothing to elevate this temple of Themis above its vulgar kind elsewhere. Dingy enough it looked, in spite of candles lighted in decent abundance. A case had just closed, and the last juror's back was seen escaping through the door in the wall of the jury box. There were some dozen barristers, some fiddling with pen and ink, others buried in briefs, some beckoning with the plumes of their pens to their attorneys, of whom there were no lack. There were clerks toing and froing, and the officers of the court, and the registrar, who was handing up a paper to the judge, and the tipstaff, who was presenting a note at the end of his wand to a king's counsel over the heads of the crowd between. If this was the High Court of Appeal, which never rose day or night, it might account for the pale and jaded aspect of everybody in it. An air of indescribable gloom hung upon the pallid features of all the people here. No one ever smiled. All looked more or less secretly suffering. "The King against Elijah Harbottle," shouted the officer. "Is the appellant Lewis Pineweck in court?" asked Chief Justice Twofold, in a voice of thunder that shook the woodwork of the court and boomed down the corridors. Up stood Pineweck from his place at the table. "Arraign the prisoner!" roared the chief, and Judge Harbottle felt the panels of the dock round him, and the floor, and the rails quiver in the vibrations of that tremendous voice. The prisoner in limine objected to this pretended court as being a sham and non-existent in point of law, and then that even if it were a court constituted by law, the judge was growing dazed. It had not and could not have any jurisdiction to try him for his conduct on the bench. Whereupon the Chief Justice laughed suddenly, and everyone in court, turning round upon the prisoner, laughed also, till the laugh grew and roared all round like a deafening acclamation. He saw nothing but glittering eyes and teeth, a universal stare and grin. But though all the voices laughed, not a single face of all those that concentrated their gaze upon him looked like a laughing face. The mirth subsided as suddenly as it began. The indictment was read. Judge Harbottle actually pleaded. He pleaded not guilty. A jury was sworn. The trial proceeded. Judge Harbottle was bewildered. This could not be real. He must be either mad or going mad, he thought. One thing could not fail to strike even him. This Chief Justice Twofold, who was knocking him about at every turn with sneer and jibe, and roaring him down with his tremendous voice, was a dilated effigy of himself, an image of Mr. Justice Harbottle, at least double his size, and with all his fierce colouring and his ferocity of eye and visage enhanced awfully. Nothing the prisoner could argue, cite or state was permitted to retard for a moment the march of the case towards its catastrophe. The Chief Justice seemed to feel his power over the jury and to exult and riot in the display of it. He glared at them, he nodded to them, he seemed to have established an understanding with them. The lights were faint in that part of the court. The jurors were mere shadows sitting in rows. The prisoner could see a dozen pair of white eyes shining coldly out of the darkness, and whenever the judge in his charge, which was contemptuously brief, nodded and grinned and jibed, the prisoner could see in the obscurity by the dip of all these rows of eyes together that the jury nodded in acquiescence. And now the charge was over. The huge Chief Justice leaned back panting and gloating on the prisoner. Everyone in the court turned about and gazed with steadfast hatred on the man in the dock. From the jury box, where the 12 sworn brethren were whispering together, a sound in the general stillness like a prolonged hiss was heard, and then, in answer to the challenge of the officer, "How say you, gentlemen of the jury, guilty or not guilty?" came in a melancholy voice, the finding guilty. The place seemed to the eyes of the prisoner to grow gradually darker and darker, till he could discern nothing distinctly but the lumen of the eyes that were turned upon him from every bench and side and corner and gallery of the building. The prisoner doubtless thought that he had quite enough to say, and conclusive, why sentence of death should not be pronounced upon him. But the Lord Chief Justice puffed it contemptuously away, like so much smoke, and proceeded to pass sentence of death upon the prisoner, having named the 10th of the ensuing month for his execution. Before he had recovered the stun of this ominous farce, in obedience to the mandate, "Remove the prisoner," he was led from the dock. The lamps seemed all to have gone out, and there were stoves and charcoal fires here and there that threw a faint crimson light on the walls of the corridors through which he passed. The stones that composed them looked now enormous, cracked and unhewn. He came into a vaulted smithy where 2 men, naked to the waist, with heads like bulls, round shoulders, and the arms of giants, were welding red-hot chains together with hammers that pelted like thunderbolts. They looked on the prisoner with fierce red eyes, and rested on their hammers for a minute, And said the elder to his companion, "Take out Elijah Harbottle's gyves." And with the pincers he plucked the end which lay dazzling in the fire from the furnace. "One end locks," said he, taking the cool end of the iron in one hand, while with the grip of a vice he seized the leg of the judge and locked the ring round his ankle. "The other," he said with a grin, "is welded." The iron band that was to form the ring for the other leg lay still red hot upon the stone floor, with brilliant sparks sporting up and down its surface. His companion, in his gigantic hands, seized the old judge's other leg and pressed his foot immovably to the stone floor, while his senior, in a twinkling, with a masterly application of pincers and hammer, sped the glowing bar around his ankle so tight that the skin and sinews smoked and bubbled again, and old Judge Harbottle uttered a yell that seemed to chill the very stones and make the iron chains quiver on the wall. Chains, vaults, smiths and smithy all vanished in a moment, but the pain continued. Mr. Justice Harbottle was suffering torture all round the ankle on which the infernal smiths had just been operating. His friends, Thavies and Bella, were startled by the judge's roar in the midst of their elegant trifling about a marriage a la mode case which was going on. The judge was in panic as well as pain. The street lamps and the light of his own hall door restored him. "I'm very bad," growled he between his set teeth. "My foot's blazing. Who was he that hurt my foot? 'Tis the gout, 'tis the gout," he said, awaking completely. "How many hours have we been coming from the playhouse? Splud, what has happened on the way? I've slept half the night." There had been no hitch or delay, and they had driven home at a good pace. The judge, however, was in gout. He was feverish too, and the attack, though very short, was sharp. And when, in about a fortnight, it subsided, his ferocious joviality did not return. He could not get this dream, as he chose to call it, out of his head. People remarked that the judge was in the vapours. His doctor said he should go for a fortnight to Paxton. Whenever the judge fell into a brown study, he was always conning over the terms of the sentence pronounced upon him in his vision, "in 1 calendar month from the date of this day," and then the usual form, "and you shall be hanged by the neck till you are dead," etc. That will be the 10th. I'm not much in the way of being hanged. I know what stuff dreams are, and I laugh at them, but this is continually in my thoughts, as if it forecasts misfortune of some sort. I wish the day my dream gave me were past and over. I wish I were well purged of my gout. I wish I were as I used to be. 'Tis nothing but vapours, nothing but a maggot. The copy of the parchment and letter which had announced his trial with many a snort and sneer he would read over and over again, and the scenery and people of his dream would rise about him in places the most unlikely, and steal him in a moment from all that surrounded him into a world of shadows. The judge had lost his iron energy and banter. He was growing taciturn and morose. The bar remarked the change, as well they might. His friends thought him ill. The doctor said he was troubled with hypochondria, and that his gout was still lurking in his system, and ordered him to that ancient haunt of crutches and chalkstones, Paxton. The judge's spirits were very low. He was frightened about himself, and he described to his housekeeper having sent for her to his study to drink a dish of tea, his strange dream in his drive home from Drury Lane Playhouse. He was sinking into the state of nervous dejection in which men lose their faith in orthodox advice, and in despair consult quacks, astrologers, and nursery storytellers. Could such a dream mean that he was to have a fit, and so die on the both? She did not think so. On the contrary, it was certain some good luck must happen on that day. The judge kindled, and for the first time for many days he looked for a minute or two like himself, and he tapped her on the cheek with the hand that was not in flannel. "Oddsbud, Oddsheart, you dear rogue, I had forgot. There is young Tom, Yellow Tom, my nephew, you know, lies sick at Harrogate. Why shouldn't he go that day as well as another? And if he does, I get an estate by it. Why, looky, I asked Dr. Headstone yesterday if I was like to take a fit any time, and he laughed and swore I was the last man in town to go off that way. The judge sent most of his servants down to Buxton to make his lodgings and all things comfortable for him. He was to follow in a day or two. It was now the 9th, and the next day well over he might laugh at his visions and auguries. On the evening of the 9th, Dr. Headstone's footman knocked at the judge's door. The doctor ran up the dusky stairs to the drawing-room. It was a March evening, near the hour of sunset, with an east wind whistling sharply through the chimney stacks. A wood fire blazed cheerily on the hearth, and Judge Harbottle, in what was then called a brigadier wig, with his red roquelaure on, helped the glowing effect of the darkened chamber, which looked red all over like a room on fire. The judge had his feet on a stool, and his huge grim purple face confronted the fire, and seemed to pant and swell as the blaze alternately spread upward and collapsed. He had fallen again among his blue devils, and was thinking of retiring from the bench, and of 50 other gloomy things. But the doctor, who was an energetic son of Aesculapius, would listen to no croaking, told the judge he was full of gout, and in his present condition no judge even of his own case, but promised him leave to pronounce on all those melancholy questions a fortnight later. In the meantime the judge must be very careful. He was overcharged with gout, and he must not provoke an attack till the waters of Buxton should do that office for him in their own salutary way. The doctor did not think him perhaps quite so well as he pretended, for he told him he wanted rest, and would be better if he went forthwith to his bed. Mr. Girningham, his valet, assisted him, and gave him his drops, and the judge told him to wait in his bedroom till he should go to sleep. 3 persons that night had specially odd stories to tell. The housekeeper had got rid of the trouble of amusing her little girl at this anxious time, by giving her leave to run about the sitting rooms and look at the pictures and china on the usual condition of touching nothing. It was not until the last gleam of sunset had for some time faded, and the twilight had so deepened that she could no longer discern the colours on the china figures on the chimney-piece or in the cabinets, that the child returned to the housekeeper's room to find her mother. To her she related, after some prattle about the china and the pictures, and the judge's 2 grand wigs in the dressing-room of the library, an adventure of an extraordinary kind. In the hall was placed, as was customary in those times, the sedan chair which the master of the house occasionally used, covered with stamped leather and studded with gilt nails, and with its red silk blinds down. In this case, the doors of this old-fashioned conveyance were locked, the windows up, and, as I said, the blinds down, but not so closely that the curious child could not peep underneath one of them and see into the interior. A parting beam from the setting sun, admitted through the window of the back room, shot obliquely through the open door, and lighting on the chair, shone with a dull transparency through the crimson blind. To her surprise, the child saw in the shadow a thin man, dressed in black, seated in it. He had sharp dark features. His nose, she fancied, a little awry, and his brown eyes were looking straight before him. His hand was on his thigh, and he stirred no more than the waxen figure she had seen at Suffolk Fair. A child is so often lectured for asking questions and on the propriety of silence and the superior wisdom of its elders, that it accepts most things at last in good faith, and the little girl acquiesced respectfully in the occupation of the chair by this mahogany-faced person as being all right and proper. It was not until she asked her mother who this man was, and observed her scared face as she questioned her more minutely upon the appearance of the stranger, that she began to understand that she had seen something unaccountable. Mrs. Carwell took the key of the chair from its nail over the footman's shelf, and led the child by the hand up to the hall, having a lighted candle in her other hand. She stopped at a distance from the chair, and placed the candlestick in the child's hand. "Peep in, Marjorie, again, and try if there's anything there," she whispered, Hold the candle near the blind so as to throw its light through the curtain." The child peeped this time with a very solemn face, and intimated at once that he was gone. "Look again and be sure," urged her mother. The little girl was quite certain, and Mrs. Carwell, with her mob cap of lace and cherry-coloured ribbons, and her dark brown hair, not yet powdered, over a very pale face, unlocked the door, looked in, and beheld emptiness. "All a mistake, child, you see. There, ma'am, see there, he's gone round the corner," said the child. "Where?" said Mrs. Carwell, stepping backward a step. "Into that room." "Tut, child, 'twas the shadow!" cried Mrs. Carwell angrily because she was frightened. "I moved the candle." But she clutched one of the poles of the chair, which leant against the wall in the corner, and pounded the floor furiously with one end of it, being afraid to pass the open door the child had pointed to. The cook and 2 kitchen maids came running upstairs, not knowing what to make of this unwonted alarm. They all searched the room, but it was still and empty, and no sign of anyone's having been there. Some people may suppose that the direction given to her thoughts by this odd little incident will account for a very strange illusion which Mrs. Carwell herself experienced about 2 hours later. Mrs. Flora Carwell was going up the great staircase with a posset for the judge in a china bowl on a little silver tray. Across the top of the well staircase there runs a massive oak rail, and raising her eyes accidentally, she saw an extremely odd-looking stranger, slim and long, leaning carelessly over with a pipe between his finger and thumb. Nose, lips and chin seemed all to droop downward into extraordinary length as he leant his odd-peering face over the banister. In his other hand he held a coil of rope, one end of which escaped from under his elbow and hung over the rail. Mrs. Carwell, who had no suspicion at the moment that he was not a real person, and fancied that he was someone employed in cording the judge's luggage, called to know what he was doing there. Instead of answering, he turned about and walked across the lobby at about the same leisurely pace at which she was ascending, and entered a room into which she followed him. It was an uncarpeted and unfurnished chamber. An open trunk lay upon the floor empty, and beside it the coil of rope, but except herself being there. Perhaps when she was able to think it over, it was a relief to was no one in the room. Mrs. Carwell was very much frightened, and now concluded that the child must have seen the same ghost that had just appeared to believe so, for the face, figure and dress described by the child were awfully like Pineweck, and this certainly was not he. Very much scared and very hysterical, Mrs. Carwell ran down to her room, afraid to look over her shoulder, and got some companions about her, and wept and talked and drank more than one cordial, and talked and wept again, and so on, until in those early days it was 10 o'clock, and time to go to bed. A scullery maid remained up finishing some of her scouring and scalding for some time after the other servants, who, as I said, were few in number, that night had got to their beds. This was a low-browed, broad-faced, intrepid wench with black hair, who did not value a ghost not a button, and treated the housekeeper's hysterics with measureless scorn. The old house was quiet now. It was near 12 o'clock. No sounds were audible except the muffled wailing of the wintry winds, piping high among the roofs and chimneys, or rumbling at intervals in under-gusts through the narrow channels of the street. The spacious solitudes of the kitchen level were awfully dark, and this sceptical kitchen wench was the only person now up and about the house. She hummed tunes to herself for a time, and then stopped and listened, and then resumed her work again. At last she was destined to be more terrified than even was the housekeeper. There was a back kitchen in this house, and from this she heard, as if coming from below its foundations, a sound like heavy strokes that seemed to shake the earth beneath her feet. Sometimes a dozen in sequence, at regular intervals, sometimes fewer. She walked out softly into the passage, and was surprised to see a dusky glow issuing from this room, as if from a charcoal fire. The room seemed thick with smoke. Looking in, she very dimly beheld a monstrous figure over a furnace, beating with a mighty hammer the rings and rivets of a chain. The strokes, swift and heavy as they looked, sounded hollow and distant. The man stopped and pointed to something on the floor that, through the smoky haze, looked, the thought, like a dead body. She remarked no more, but the servants in the room close by, startled from their sleep by a hideous scream, found her in a swoon on the flags close to the door, where she had just witnessed this ghastly vision. Startled by the girl's incoherent asseverations that she had seen the judge's corpse on the floor, two servants, having first searched the lower part of the house, went rather frightened upstairs to inquire whether their master was well. They found him, not in his bed, but in his room. He had a table with candles burning at his bedside and was getting on his clothes again, and he swore and cursed at them roundly in his old style, telling them that he had business, and that he would discharge on the spot any scoundrel who should dare to disturb him again. So the invalid was left to his quietude. In the morning it was rumoured here and there in the street that the judge was dead. A servant was sent from the house 3 doors away by Councillor Travers to inquire at Judge Harbottle's hall door. The servant who opened it was pale and reserved, and would only say that the judge was ill. He had had a dangerous accident. Dr. Headston had been with him at 7 o'clock in the morning. There were averted looks, short answers, pale and frowning faces, and all the usual signs that there was a secret that sat heavily upon their minds, and the time for disclosing which had not yet come. That time would arrive when the coroner had arrived, and the mortal scandal that had befallen the house could be no longer hidden. For that morning Mr. Justice Harbottle had been found hanging by the neck from the banister at the top of the great staircase, and quite dead. There was not the smallest sign of any struggle or resistance. There had not been heard a cry or any other noise in the slightest degree indicative of violence. There was medical evidence to show that in his atrabilious state it was quite on the cards that he might have made away with himself. The jury found accordingly that it was a case of suicide. But to those who were acquainted with the strange story which Judge Harbottle had related to at least 2 persons, the fact that the catastrophe occurred on the morning of March 10th seemed a startling coincidence. A few days after, the pomp of a great funeral attended him to the grave, and so, in the language of Scripture, the rich man died and was buried. The end. Afterward by Edith Wharton, and read by Christopher Holton. Oh, there is one, of course, but you'll never know it. The assertion, laughingly flung out 6 months earlier in a bright June garden, came back to Mary Boyne with a sharp perception of its latent significance as she stood in the December dusk, waiting for the lamps to be brought into the library. The words had been spoken by their friend Alida Stair as they sat at tea on her lawn at Pangbourne, in reference to the very house of which the library in question was the central, the pivotal feature. Mary Boyne and her husband, in quest of a country place in one of the southern or southwestern counties, had on their arrival in England carried their problem straight to Alida Stair, who had successfully solved it in her own case. But it was not until they had rejected, almost capriciously, several practical and judicious suggestions that she threw it out. Well, there's Ling in Dorsetshire. It belongs to Hugo's cousins, and you can get it for a song. The reason she gave for its being obtainable on these terms, its remoteness from a station, its lack of electric light, hot water pipes, and other vulgar necessities, were exactly those pleading in its favour with 2 romantic Americans perversely in search of the economic drawbacks which were associated in their tradition with unusual architectural felicities. I should never believe I was living in an old house unless I was thoroughly uncomfortable, Ned Boyne, the more extravagant of the 2, had jocosely insisted. The least hint of convenience would make me think it had been bought out of an exhibition with the pieces numbered and set up again. And they had proceeded to enumerate with humorous precision their various suspicions and exactions, refusing to believe that the house their cousin recommended was really Tudor till they learned it had no heating system, or that the village church was literally in the grounds till she assured them of the deplorable uncertainty of the water supply. It's too uncomfortable to be true. Edward Boyne had continued to exult as the avowal of each disadvantage was successively wrung from her, but he had cut short his rhapsody to ask with a sudden relapse to distrust, "And the ghost? You've been concealing from us the fact that there is no ghost." Mary at the moment had laughed with him, yet almost with her laugh, being possessed of several sets of independent perceptions, had noted a sudden flatness of tone in Alida's answering hilarity. "Oh, Dorsetshire's full of ghosts, you know. Yes, but that won't do. I don't want to have to drive 10 miles to see somebody else's ghost. I want one of my own on the premises. Is there a ghost at Ling?" His rejoinder had made Alida laugh again, and it was then that she had flung back tantalizingly, "Oh, there is one, of course, but you'll never know it." "Never know it?" Boyne pulled her up. "But what in the world constitutes a ghost except the fact of its being known for one?" "I can't say, but that's the story. That there's a ghost, but that nobody knows it's a ghost. Well, not till afterward, at any rate." "Till afterward? Not till long afterward. But if it's once been identified as an unearthly visitant, why hasn't its signalment been handed down in the family? How has it managed to preserve its incognito?" Alida could only shake her head. "Don't ask me, but it has." And then suddenly Mary spoke up as if from some cavernous depth of divination. Suddenly, long afterward, one says to oneself, "That was it." She was oddly startled at the sepulchral sound with which her question fell on the banter of the other two, and she saw the shadow of the same surprise flit across Alida's clear pupils. "I suppose so. One just has to wait." "Oh, hang waiting," Ned broke in. "Life's too short for a ghost who can only be enjoyed in retrospect. Can't we do better than that, Mary?" But it turned out that in the event they were not destined to, for within 3 months of their conversation with Mrs. Stair, they were established at Ling, and the life they had yearned for to the point of planning it out in all its daily details had actually begun for them. It was to sit in the thick December dusk by just such a wide-hooded fireplace, under just such black oak rafters, with the sense that beyond the mullioned panes the downs were darkening to a deeper solitude. It was for the ultimate indulgence in such sensations that Mary Boyne had endured for nearly 14 years the soul-deadening ugliness of the Middle West, and that Boyne had ground on doggedly at his engineering till with a suddenness that still made her blink. The prodigious windfall of the Blue Star mine had put them at a stroke in possession of life and the leisure to taste it. They had never for a moment meant their new state to be one of idleness, but they meant to give themselves only to harmonious activities. She had her vision of painting and gardening, against a background of grey walls. He dreamed of the production of his long-planned book on the economic basis of culture, and with such absorbing work ahead no existence could be too sequestered. They could not get far enough from the world or plunge deep enough into the past. Dorsetshire had attracted them from the first by a semblance of remoteness out of all proportion to its geographical position. But to the Boynes it was one of the ever-recurring wonders of the whole incredibly compressed island, a nest of counties, as they put it, that for the production of its effects so little of a given quality went so far, that so few miles made a distance, and so short a distance a difference. "It's that," Ned had once enthusiastically explained, "that gives such depth to their effects, such relief to their least contrasts. They've been able to lay the butter so thick on every exquisite mouthful." The butter had certainly been laid on thick at Ling. The old grey house, hidden under a shoulder of the downs, had almost all the finer marks of commerce with a protracted past. The mere fact that it was neither large nor exceptional made it, to the Boynes, abound the more richly in its special sense, the sense of having been for centuries a deep, dim reservoir of life. The life had probably not been of the most vivid order. For long periods, no doubt, it had fallen as noiselessly into the past as the quiet drizzle of autumn fell hour after hour into the green fish pond between the yews. But these backwaters of existence sometimes breed, in their sluggish depths, strange acuities of emotion, and Mary Boyne had felt from the first the occasional brush of an intenser memory. The feeling had never been stronger than on the December afternoon, when, waiting in the library for the belated lamps, she rose from her seat and stood among the shadows of the hearth. Her husband had gone off after luncheon for one of his long tramps on the downs. She had noticed of late that he preferred to be unaccompanied on these occasions, and in the tried security of their personal relations, had been driven to conclude that his book was bothering him, and that he needed the afternoons to turn over in solitude the problems left from the morning's work. Certainly the book was not going as smoothly as she had imagined it would, and the lines of perplexity between his eyes had never been there in his engineering days. Then he had often looked fagged to the verge of illness, but the native demon of worry had never branded his brow. Yet the few pages he had so far read to her, the introduction and a synopsis of the opening chapter, gave evidences of a firm possession of his subject and a deepening confidence in his powers. The fact threw her into deeper perplexity, since, now that he had done with business and its disturbing contingencies, the one other possible element of anxiety was eliminated. Unless it were his health, then. But physically he had gained since they had come to Dorsetshire, grown robuster, ruddier, and fresher-eyed. It was only within a week that she had felt in him the undefinable change that made her restless in his absence and as tongue-tied in his presence as though it were she who had a secret to keep from him. The thought that there was a secret somewhere between them struck her with a sudden smart rap of wonder, and she looked about her down the dim, long room. "Can it be the house?" she mused. The room itself might have been full of secrets. They seemed to be piling themselves up as evening fell, like the layers and layers of velvet shadow dropping from the low ceiling, the dusky walls of books, the smoke-blurred sculpture of the hooded hearth. "Why, of course, the house is haunted," she reflected. The ghost, Alida's imperceptible ghost, after figuring largely in the banter of their first month or two at Ling, had been gradually discarded as too ineffectual for imaginative use. Mary had indeed, as became the tenant of a haunted house, made the customary inquiries among her few rural neighbours, but beyond a vague, "They do say so, mum," the villagers had nothing to impart. The elusive spectre had apparently never had sufficient identity for a legend to crystallise about it, and after a time the Boynes had laughingly set the matter down to their profit and loss account, agreeing that Ling was one of the few houses good enough in itself to dispense with supernatural enhancements. "And I suppose, poor ineffectual demon, that's why it beats its beautiful wings in vain in the void," Mary had laughingly concluded. Or rather, Ned answered in the same strain, "Why, amid so much that's ghostly, it can never affirm its separate existence as the ghost." And thereupon their invisible housemate had finally dropped out of their references, which were numerous enough to make them promptly unaware of the loss. Now, as she stood on the hearth, the subject of their earlier curiosity revived in her with a new sense of its meaning, a sense gradually acquired through close daily contact with the scene of the lurking mystery. It was the house itself, of course, that possessed the ghost-seeing faculty that communed visually but secretly with its own past, and if one could only get into close enough communion with the house, one might surprise its secret and acquire the ghost sight on one's own account. Perhaps in his long solitary hours in this very room, where she never trespassed till the afternoon, her husband had acquired it already, and was silently carrying the dread weight of whatever it had revealed to him. Mary was too well versed in the code of the spectral world not to know that one could not talk about the ghosts one saw. To do so was almost as great a breach of good breeding as to name a lady in a club. But this explanation did not really satisfy her. What, after all, except for the fun of the frisson, she reflected, would he really care for any of their old ghosts? And thence she was thrown back once more on the fundamental dilemma, the fact that one's greater or less susceptibility to spectral influences had no particular bearing on the case, since when one did see a ghost at Ling, one did not know it. Not till long afterward, Aldeburgh had said. Well, supposing Ned had seen one when they first came, and had known only within the last week what had happened to him. More and more under the spell of the hour, she threw back her searching thoughts to the early days of their tenancy, but at first only to recall a gay confusion of unpacking, settling, arranging of books, and calling to each other from remote corners of the house as treasure after treasure of their habitation revealed itself to them. It was in this particular connection that she presently recalled a certain soft afternoon of the previous October, when, passing from the first rapturous flurry of exploration to a detailed inspection of the old house, she had pressed, like a novel heroine, a panel that opened at her touch on a narrow flight of stairs leading to an unsuspected flat ledge of the roof which from below seemed to slope away on all sides too abruptly for any but practised feet to scale. The view from this hidden coign was enchanting, and she had flown down to snatch Ned from his papers and give him the freedom of her discovery. She remembered still how, standing on the narrow ledge, he had passed his arm about her while their gaze flew to the long tossed horizon line of the downs, and then dropped contentedly back to trace the arabesque of yew hedges about the fish pond and the shadow of the cedar on the lawn. And now the other way, he had said, gently turning her about within his arm, and closely pressed to him, she had absorbed, like some long satisfying draught, the picture of the grey-walled court, the squat lines on the gates, and the lime avenue reaching up to the high road under the downs. It was just then, while they gazed and held each other, that she had felt his arm relax and heard a sharp hello that made her turn to glance at him. Distinctly, yes, she now recalled she had seen, as she glanced, a shadow of anxiety, of perplexity rather, fall across his face, and following his eyes had beheld the figure of a man in loose greyish clothes as it appeared to her, who was sauntering down the lime avenue to the court with the tentative gait of a stranger seeking his way. Her short-sighted eyes had given her but a blurred impression of slightness and greyness, with something foreign, or at least unlocal, in the cut of the figure or its garb, but her husband had apparently seen more, seen enough to make him push past her with a sharp "Wait!" and dash down the twisting stairs without pausing to give her a hand for the descent. A slight tendency to dizziness obliged her, after a provisional clutch at the chimney against which they had been leaning, to follow him down more cautiously, and when she had reached the attic landing, she paused again for a less definite reason, leaning over the oak banister to strain her eyes through the silence of the brown sun-flecked depths below. She lingered there till, somewhere in those depths, she heard the closing of a door. Then, mechanically impelled, she went down the shallow flights of steps till she reached the lower hall. The front door stood open on the mild sunlight of the court, and hall and court were empty. The library door was open too, and after listening in vain for any sound of voices within, she quickly crossed the threshold and found her husband alone, vaguely fingering the papers on his desk. He looked up as if surprised at her precipitate entrance, but the shadow of anxiety had passed from his face, leaving it even, as she fancied, a little brighter and clearer than usual. "What was it? Who was it?" she asked. "Who?" he repeated, with the surprise still all on his side. "The man we saw coming towards the house." He seemed honestly to reflect. "The man? Why, I thought I saw Peters. I dashed after him to say a word about the stable drains, but he had disappeared before I could get down." Disappeared? Why, he seemed to be walking so slowly when we saw him. Boyne shrugged his shoulders. "So I thought, but he must have got up steam in the interval. What do you say to our trying a scramble up Meldon Steep before sunset?" That was all. At the time, the occurrence had been less than nothing, had indeed been immediately obliterated by the magic of their first vision from Meldon Steep, a height which they had dreamed of climbing ever since they had first seen its bare spine heaving itself above the low roof of Ling. Doubtless it was the mere fact of the other incidents having occurred on the very day of their ascent to Meldon that had kept it stored away in the unconscious fold of association from which it now emerged, for in itself it had no mark of the portentous. At the moment there could have been nothing more natural than that Ned should dash himself from the roof in the pursuit of dilatory tradesmen. It was the period when they were always on the watch for one or the other of the specialists employed about the place, always lying in wait for them, and dashing out at them with questions, reproaches, or reminders. And certainly in the distance the grey figure had looked like Peter's. Yet now, as she reviewed the rapid scene, she felt her husband's explanation of it to have been invalidated by the look of anxiety on his face. Why had the familiar appearance of Peter's made him anxious? Why, above all, if it was of such prime necessity to confer with that authority on the subject of the stable drains, had the failure to find him produced such a look of relief? Mary could not say that any one of these considerations had occurred to her at the time, yet from the promptness with which they now marshalled themselves at her summons, she had a sudden sense that they must all along have been there waiting their hour. Weary with her thoughts, she moved towards the window. The library was now completely dark, and she was surprised to see how much faint light the outer world still held. As she peered out into it across the court, a figure shaped itself in the tapering perspective of bare lines. It looked a mere blot of deeper grey in the greyness, and for an instant, as it moved toward her, her heart thumped to the thought, "It's the ghost!" She had time in that long instant to feel suddenly that the man of whom, 2 months earlier, she had a brief distant vision from the roof, was now, at his predestined hour, about to reveal himself as not having been Peter's, and her spirit sank under the impending fear of the disclosure. But almost with the next tick of the clock, the ambiguous figure, gaining substance and character, showed itself even to her weak sight as her husband's, and she turned away to meet him as he entered, with the confession of her folly. "It's really too absurd," she laughed out from the threshold, "but I never can remember." "Remember what?" Boyne questioned as they drew together. "That when one sees the Ling ghost one never knows it." Her hand was on his sleeve, and he kept it there, but with no response in his gesture or in the lines of his fagged, preoccupied face. "Did you think you'd seen it?" he asked, after an appreciable interval. "Why, I actually took you for it, my dear, in my mad determination to spot it." "Me, just now!" His arm dropped away, and he turned from her with a faint echo of her laugh. "Really, dearest, you'd better give it up, if that's the best you can do." "Yes, I give it up. Have you?" she asked, turning round on him abruptly. The parlour-maid had entered with letters and a lamp, and the light struck up into Boyne's face as he bent above the tray she presented. "Have you?" Mary perversely insisted, when the servant had disappeared on her errand of illumination. "Have I what?" he rejoined absently, the light bringing out the sharp stamp of worry between his brows as he turned over the letters. "Given up trying to see the ghost?" Her heart beat a little at the experiment she was making. Her husband, laying his letters aside, moved away into the shadow of the hearth. "I never tried," he said, tearing open the wrapper of a newspaper. "Well, of course," Mary persisted, "the exasperating thing is that there's no use trying, since one can't be sure till so long afterward." He was unfolding the paper as if he had hardly heard her, but after a pause during which the sheets rustled spasmodically between his hands, he lifted his head to say abruptly, "Have you any idea how long?" Mary had sunk into a low chair beside the fireplace. From her seat she looked up startled at her husband's profile, which was darkly projected against the circle of lamplight. "No, none. Have you?" she retorted, repeating her former phrase with an added keenness of intention. Boyne crumpled the paper into a bunch, and then inconsequently turned back with it towards the lamp. Lord, no, I only meant, he explained, with a faint tinge of impatience, is there any legend, any tradition as to that? Not that I know of, she answered, but the impulse to add, what makes you ask, was checked by the reappearance of the parlour-maid with tea and a second lamp. With the dispersal of shadows and the repetition of the daily domestic office, Mary Boyne felt herself less oppressed by that sense of something mutely imminent which had darkened her solitary afternoon. For a few moments she gave herself silently to the details of her task, and when she looked up from it she was struck to the point of bewilderment by the change in her husband's face. He had seated himself near the farther lamp, and was absorbed in the perusal of his letters, but was it something he had found in them, or merely the shifting of her own point of view that had restored his features to their normal aspect? The longer she looked, the more definitely the change affirmed itself. The lines of painful tension had vanished, and such traces of fatigue as lingered were of the kind easily attributable to steady mental effort. He glanced up as if drawn by her gaze and met her eyes with a smile. "I'm dying for my tea, you know, and here's a letter for you," he said. She took the letter he held out in exchange for the cup she proffered him, and returning to her seat, broke the seal with the languid gesture of the reader whose interests are all enclosed in the circle of one cherished presence. Her next conscious motion was that of starting to her feet, the letter falling to them as she rose, while she held out to her husband a long newspaper clipping. "Ned, what's this? What does it mean?" He had risen at the same instant, almost as if hearing her cry before she uttered it, and for a perceptible space of time he and she studied each other like adversaries watching for an advantage across the space between her chair and his desk. "What's what? You fairly made me jump," Boyne said at length, moving toward her with a sudden half-exasperated laugh. The shadow of apprehension was on his face again. Not now a look of fixed foreboding, but a shifting vigilance of lips and eyes that gave her the sense of his feeling himself invisibly surrounded. Her hand shook so that she could hardly give him the clipping. "This article from the Waukesha Sentinel, that a man named Elwell has brought suit against you, that there was something wrong about the Blue Star Mine. I can't understand more than half." They continued to face each other as she spoke, and to her astonishment she saw that her words had the almost immediate effect of dissipating the strained watchfulness of his look. "Oh, that!" He glanced down the printed slip, and then folded it with the gesture of one who handles something harmless and familiar. "What's the matter with you this afternoon, Mary? I thought you'd got bad news." She stood before him with her undefinable terror subsiding slowly under the reassuring touch of his composure. "You knew about this, then? It's all right?" "Certainly I knew about it, and it's all right." "But what is it? I don't understand. What does this man accuse you of?" "Oh, pretty nearly every crime in the calendar." Boyne had tossed the clipping down and thrown himself comfortably into an armchair near the fire. "Do you want to hear the story? It's not particularly interesting. Just a squabble over interests in the Blue Star." "But who is this Elwell? I don't know the name." "Oh, he's a fellow I put into it. Gave him a hand up. I told you all about him at the time." "I dare say I must have forgotten." Vainly she strained back among her memories. "But if you helped him, why does he make this return?" "Oh, probably some shyster lawyer got hold of him and talked him over. It's all rather technical and complicated. I thought that kind of thing bored you." His wife felt a sting of compunction. Theoretically, she deprecated the American wife's detachment from her husband's professional interests, but in practice she had always found it difficult to fix her attention on Boyne's report of the transactions in which his varied interests involved him. Besides, she had felt from the first that in a community where the amenities of living could be obtained only at the cost of efforts as arduous as her husband's professional labours, such brief leisure as they could command should be used as an escape from immediate preoccupations, a flight to the life they always dreamed of living. Once or twice, now that this new life had actually drawn its magic circle about them, She had asked herself if she had done right. But hitherto such conjectures had been no more than the retrospective excursions of an active fancy. Now, for the first time, it startled her a little to find how little she knew of the material foundation on which her happiness was built. She glanced again at her husband and was reassured by the composure of his face, yet she felt the need of more definite grounds for her reassurance. "But doesn't this suit worry you? Why have you never spoken to me about it?" He answered both questions at once. "I didn't speak of it at first because it did worry me, annoyed me rather, but it's all ancient history now. Your correspondent must have got hold of a back number of the Sentinel." She felt a quick thrill of relief. "You mean it's over? He's lost his case?" There was a just perceptible delay in Boyne's reply. "The suit's been withdrawn, that's all." But she persisted, as if to exonerate herself from the inward charge of being too easily put off. Withdrawn because he saw he had no chance? "Oh, he had no chance," Boyne answered. She was still struggling with a dimly felt perplexity at the back of her thoughts. How long ago was it withdrawn? He paused as if with a slight return of his former uncertainty. "I've just had the news now, but I've been expecting it." "Just now, in one of your letters?" "Yes, in one of my letters." She made no answer and was aware only after a short interval of waiting that he had risen and, strolling across the room, had placed himself on the sofa at her side. She felt him, as he did so, pass an arm about her. She felt his hand seek hers and clasp it, and turning slowly, drawn by the warmth of his cheek, she met the smiling clearness of his eyes. It's all right," she questioned, through the flood of her dissolving doubts. "And I give you my word, it never was righter." He laughed back at her, holding her close. One of the strangest things she was afterward to recall out of all the next day's incredible strangeness was the sudden and complete recovery of her sense of security. It was in the air when she woke in her low-ceilinged, dusky room. It accompanied her downstairs to the breakfast table, flashed out at her from the fire, and reduplicated itself brightly from the flanks of the urn and the sturdy flutings of the Georgian teapot. It was as if, in some roundabout way, all her diffused apprehensions of the previous day, with their moment of sharp concentration about the newspaper article, as if this dim questioning of the future and startled return upon the past had between them liquidated the arrears of some haunting moral obligation. If she had indeed been careless of her husband's affairs, it was, her new state seemed to prove, because her faith in him instinctively justified such carelessness, and his right to her faith had overwhelmingly affirmed itself in the very face of menace and suspicion. She had never seen him more untroubled, more naturally and unconsciously in possession of himself, than after the cross-examination to which she had subjected him. It was almost as if he had been aware of her lurking doubts, and had wanted the air cleared as much as she did. It was as clear, thank heaven, as the bright outer light that surprised her almost with a touch of summer when she issued from the house for her daily round of the gardens. She had left Boyne at his desk, indulging herself as she passed the library door by a last peep at his quiet face, where he bent, pipe in his mouth, above his papers, and now she had her own morning's task to perform. The task involved on such charm winter days almost as much delighted loitering about the different quarters of her domain as if spring were already at work on shrubs and borders. There were such inexhaustible possibilities still before her, such opportunities to bring out the latent graces of the old place without a single irreverent touch of alteration, that the winter months were all too short to plan what spring and autumn executed. And her recovered sense of safety gave on this particular morning a peculiar zest to her progress through the sweet still place. She went first to the kitchen garden, where the espaliered pear trees drew complicated patterns on the walls, and pigeons were fluttering and preening about the silvery slated roof of their cot. There was something wrong about the piping of the hothouse, and she was expecting an authority from Dorchester, who was to drive out between trains and make a diagnosis of the boiler. But when she dipped into the damp heat of the greenhouses, among the spice scents and waxy pinks and reds of old-fashioned exotics, even the flora of Ling was in the note. She learned that the great man had not arrived, and the day being too rare to waste in an artificial atmosphere, she came out again and paced slowly along the springy turf of the bowling green to the gardens behind the house. At their farther end rose a grass terrace, commanding over the fish pond and the yew hedges a view of the long house front, with its twisted chimney stacks and the blue shadows of its roof angles, all drenched in the pale gold moisture of the air. Seen thus across the level tracery of the yews, under the suffused mild light, it sent her from its open windows and hospitably smoking chimneys the look of some warm human presence, of a mind slowly ripened on a sunny wall of experience. She had never before had so deep a sense of her intimacy with it, such a conviction that its secrets were all beneficent, kept, as they said to children, for one's good, so complete a trust in its power to gather up her life and Ned's into the harmonious pattern of the long, long story it sat there weaving in the sun. She heard steps behind her and turned, expecting to see the gardener accompanied by the engineer from Dorchester, but only one figure was in sight, that of a youngish, slightly built man, who, for reasons she could not on the spot have specified, did not remotely resemble her preconceived notion of an authority on hothouse boilers. The newcomer, on seeing her, lifted his hat and paused with the air of a gentleman, perhaps a traveller desirous of having it immediately known that his intrusion is involuntary. The local fame of Ling occasionally attracted the more intelligent sightseer, and Mary half expected to see the stranger dissemble a camera or justify his presence by producing it. But he made no gesture of any sort, and after a moment she asked, in a tone responding to the courteous deprecation of his attitude, "Is there anyone you wish to see?" "I came to see Mr. Boyne," he replied. His intonation, rather than his accent, was faintly American, and Mary, at the familiar note, looked at him more closely. The brim of his soft felt hat cast a shade on his face, which, thus obscured, wore to her short-sighted gaze a look of seriousness, as of a person arriving on business, and civilly but firmly aware of his rights. Past experience had made Mary equally sensible to such claims, but she was jealous of her husband's morning hours, and doubtful of his having given anyone the right to intrude on them. "Have you an appointment with Mr. Boyne?" she asked. He hesitated, as if unprepared for the question. "Not exactly an appointment," he replied. "Then I'm afraid, this being his working time, that he can't receive you now. Will you give me a message or come back later?" The visitor, again lifting his hat, briefly replied that he would come back later, and walked away, as if to regain the front of the house. As his figure receded down the walk between the yew hedges, Mary saw him pause and look up an instant at the peaceful house front bathed in faint winter sunshine. And it struck her, with a tardy touch of compunction, that it would have been more humane to ask if he had come from a distance, and to offer, in that case, to inquire if her husband could receive him. But as the thought occurred to her, he passed out of sight behind a pyramidal yew, and at the same moment her attention was distracted by the approach of the gardener, attended by the bearded pepper and salt figure of the boiler-maker from Dorchester. The encounter with this authority led to such far-reaching issues that they resulted in his finding it expedient to ignore his train, and beguiled Mary into spending the remainder of the morning in absorbed confabulation among the greenhouses. She was startled to find, when the colloquy ended, that it was nearly luncheon time, and she half expected, as she hurried back to the house, to see her husband coming out to meet her. But she found no one in the court but an under-gardener raking the gravel, and the hall, when she entered it, was so silent that she guessed Boyne to be still at work behind the closed door of the library. Not wishing to disturb him, she turned into the drawing-room, and there, at her writing table, lost herself in renewed calculations of the outlay to which the morning's conference had committed her. The knowledge that she could permit herself such follies had not yet lost its novelty, and somehow, in contrast to the vague apprehensions of the previous days, it now seemed an element of her recovered security, of the sense that, as Ned had said, things in general had never been righter. She was still luxuriating in a lavish play of figures when the parlour-maid from the threshold roused her with a dubiously worded inquiry as to the expediency of serving luncheon. It was one of their jokes that Trimmel announced luncheon as if she were divulging a state secret, and Mary, intent upon her papers, merely murmured an absent-minded assent. She felt Trimmel wavering expressively on the threshold, as if in rebuke of such off-hand acquiescence. Then her retreating steps sounded down the passage, and Mary, pushing away her papers, crossed the hall and went to the library door. It was still closed, and she wavered in her turn, disliking to disturb her husband, yet anxious that he should not exceed his normal measure of work. As she stood there, balancing her impulses, the esoteric Trimmel returned with the announcement of luncheon, and Mary, thus impelled, opened the door and went into the library. Boyne was not at his desk, and she peered about her, expecting to discover him at the bookshelves somewhere down the length of the room, but her call brought no response, and gradually it became clear to her that he was not in the library. She turned back to the parlour-maid. "Mr. Boyne must be upstairs. Please tell him that luncheon is ready." The parlour-maid appeared to hesitate between the obvious duty of obeying orders and an equally obvious conviction of the foolishness of the injunction laid upon her. The struggle resulted in her saying doubtfully, "If you please, madam, Mr. Boyne's not upstairs." "Not in his room? Are you sure?" "I'm sure, madam." Mary consulted the clock. "Where is he then?" "He's gone out," Trimmel announced, with the superior air of one who has respectfully waited for the question that a well-ordered mind would have first propounded. Mary's previous conjecture had been right then. Boyne must have gone to the gardens to meet her, and since she had missed him, it was clear that he had taken the shorter way by the south door, instead of going around to the court. She crossed the hall to the glass portal opening directly on the yew garden, but the parlour-maid, after another moment of inner conflict, decided to bring out recklessly, "Please, madam, Mr. Boyne didn't go that way." Mary turned back. "Where did he go, and when—" "He went out of the front door, up the drive, madam." It was a matter of principle with Trimmel never to answer more than one question at a time. Up the drive? At this hour? Mary went to the door herself and glanced across the court through the long tunnel of bare limes, but its perspective was as empty as when she had scanned it on entering the house. "Did Mr. Boyne leave no message?" she asked. Trimmel seemed to surrender herself to a last struggle with the forces of chaos. "No, madam, he just went out with the gentleman." "The gentleman? What gentleman?" Mary wheeled about as if to front this new factor. "The gentleman who called, madam," said Trimmel resignedly. "When did a gentleman call? Do explain yourself, Trimmel." Only the fact that Mary was very hungry, and that she wanted to consult her husband about the greenhouses, would have caused her to lay so unusual an injunction on her attendant, and even now she was detached enough to note in Trimmel's eye the dawning defiance of the respectful subordinate who has been pressed too hard. "I couldn't exactly say the hour, madam, because I didn't let the gentleman in," she replied, with the air of magnanimously ignoring the irregularity of her mistress's course. "You didn't let him in?" "No, madam. When the bell rang I was dressing, and Agnes—" "Go and ask Agnes then," Mary interjected. Trimmel still wore her look of patient magnanimity. "Agnes would not know, madam, for she had unfortunately burnt her hand in trying the wick of the new lamp from town." Trimmel, as Mary was aware, had always been opposed to the new lamp, and so Mrs. Dockett sent the kitchen maid instead. Mary looked again at the clock. "It's after 2. Go and ask the kitchen maid if Mr. Boyne left any word." She went into luncheon without waiting, and Trimmel presently brought her there the kitchen maid's statement that the gentleman had called about 1 o'clock, that Mr. Boyne had gone out with him without leaving any message. The kitchen maid did not even know the caller's name, for he had written it on a slip of paper, which he had folded and handed to her, with the injunction to deliver it at once to Mr. Boyne. Mary finished her luncheon, still wondering, and when it was over and Trimmle had brought the coffee to the drawing-room, her wonder had deepened to a first faint tinge of disquietude. It was unlike Boyne to absent himself without explanation at so unwonted an hour, and the difficulty of identifying the visitor whose summons he had apparently obeyed made his disappearance the more unaccountable. Mary Boyne's experience as the wife of a busy engineer, subject to sudden calls and compelled to keep irregular hours, had trained her to the philosophic acceptance of surprises, but since Boyne's withdrawal from business, he had adopted a Benedictine regularity of life, as if to make up for the dispersed and agitated years, with their stand-up lunches and dinners rattled down to the joltings of the dining car. He cultivated the last refinements of punctuality and monotony, discouraging his wife's fancy for the unexpected, and declaring that to a delicate taste there were infinite gradations of pleasure in the fixed recurrences of habit. Still, since no life can completely defend itself from the unforeseen, it was evident that all Boyne's precautions would sooner or later prove unavailable, and Mary concluded that he had cut short a tiresome visit by walking with his caller to the station, or at least accompanying him for part of the way. This conclusion relieved her from farther preoccupation, and she went out herself to take up her conference with the gardener. Thence she walked to the village post office a mile or so away, and when she turned towards home, the early twilight was setting in. She had taken a footpath across the downs, and as Boyne meanwhile had probably returned from the station by the high road, there was little likelihood of their meeting on the way. She felt sure, however, of his having reached the house before her, so sure that when she entered it herself, without even pausing to inquire of Trimmle, she made directly for the library. But the library was still empty, and with an unwonted precision of visual memory, she immediately observed that the papers on her husband's desk lay precisely as they had lain when she had gone in to call him to luncheon. Then, of a sudden, she was seized by a vague dread of the unknown. She had closed the door behind her on entering, and as she stood alone in the long, silent, shadowy room, her dread seemed to take shape and sound, to be there audibly breathing and lurking among the shadows. Her short-sighted eyes strained through them, half discerning an actual presence, something aloof that watched and knew, and in the recoil from that intangible propinquity, she threw herself suddenly on the bell-rope and gave it a desperate pull. The long quavering summons brought Trimmle in precipitately with a lamp, and Mary breathed again at this sobering reappearance of the usual. "You may bring tea if Mr. Boyne is in," she said to justify her ring. "Very well, madam, but Mr. Boyne is not in," said Trimmle, putting down the lamp. "Not in? You mean he's come back and gone out again?" "No, madam, he's never been back." The dread stirred again, and Mary knew that now it had her fast. Not since he went out with the gentleman. Not since he went out with the gentleman. But who was the gentleman? Mary gasped out, with the sharp note of someone trying to be heard through a confusion of meaningless noises. "That I couldn't say, madam." Trimmle, standing there by the lamp, seemed suddenly to grow less round and rosy, as though eclipsed by the same creeping shade of apprehension. "But the kitchen maid knows. Wasn't it the kitchen maid who let him in?" "She doesn't know either, madam, for he wrote his name on a folded paper." Mary, through her agitation, was aware that they were both designating the unknown visitor by a vague pronoun instead of the conventional formula which, till then, had kept their allusions within the bounds of custom, and at the same moment her mind caught at the suggestion of the folded paper. "But he must have a name. Where is the paper?" She moved to the desk and began to turn over the scattered documents that littered it. The first that caught her eye was an unfinished letter in her husband's hand, with his pen lying across it as though dropped there at a sudden summons. "My dear Parvis." Who was Parvis? "I have just received your letter announcing Elwell's death, and while I suppose there is now no farther risk of trouble, it might be safer." She tossed the sheet aside and continued her search, but no folded paper was discoverable among the letters and pages of manuscript which had been swept together in a promiscuous heap, as if by a hurried or a startled gesture. But the kitchen maid saw him. "Send her here," she commanded, wondering at her dullness in not thinking sooner of so simple a solution. Trimmle, at the behest, vanished in a flash, as if thankful to be out of the room, and when she reappeared, conducting the agitated underling, Mary had regained her self-possession and had her questions pat. The gentleman was a stranger, yes, and that she understood. But what had he said? And above all, what had he looked like? The first question was easily enough answered for the disconcerting reason that he had said so little, had merely asked for Mr. Boyne, and, scribbling something on a bit of paper, had requested that it should at once be carried in to him. Then you don't know what he wrote? You're not sure it was his name? The kitchen maid was not sure, but supposed it was, since he had written it in answer to her inquiry as to whom she should announce. "And when you carried the paper into Mr. Boyne, what did he say?" The kitchen maid did not think that Mr. Boyne had said anything, but she could not be sure, for just as she had handed him the paper and he was opening it, she had become aware that the visitor had followed her into the library, and she had slipped out, leaving the two gentlemen together. "But then, if you left them in the library, how do you know that they went out of the house?" This question plunged the witness into momentary inarticulateness, from which she was rescued by Trimmle, who, by means of ingenious circumlocutions, elicited the statement that before she could cross the hall to the back passage, she had heard the gentleman behind her, and had seen them go out of the front door together. "Then, if you saw the gentleman twice, you must be able to tell me what he looked like." But with this final challenge to her powers of expression, it became clear that the limit of the kitchen maid's endurance had been reached. The obligation of going to the front door to show in a visitor was in itself so subversive of the fundamental order of things that it had thrown her faculties into hopeless disarray, and she could only stammer out after various panting efforts at evocation, "His hat, mum, was different like, as you might say." "Different? How different?" Mary flashed out at her own mind in the same instant, leaping back to an image left on it that morning, but temporarily lost under layers of subsequent impressions. "His hat had a wide brim, you mean, and his face was pale, a youngish face." Mary pressed her with a white-lipped intensity of interrogation, but if the kitchen maid found any adequate answer to this challenge, it was swept away for her listener down the rushing current of her own convictions. The stranger in the garden! Why had Mary not thought of him before? She needed no one now to tell her that it was he who had called for her husband and gone away with him. But who was he, and why had Boyne obeyed his call? It leaped out at her suddenly, like a grin out of the dark, that they had often called England so little, such a confoundedly hard place to get lost in. A confoundedly hard place to get lost in, that had been her husband's phrase, and now with the whole machinery of official investigation sweeping its flashlights from shore to shore and across the dividing straits, now with Boyne's name blazing from the walls of every town and village, his portrait, how that wrung her, hawked up and down the country like the image of a hunted criminal. Now the little compact populous island, so policed, surveyed and administered, revealed itself as a sphinx-like guardian of abysmal mysteries, staring back into his wife's anguished eyes, as if with the malicious joy of knowing something they would never know. In the fortnight since Boyne's disappearance there had been no word of him, no trace of his movements. Even the usual misleading reports that raise expectancy in tortured bosoms had been few and fleeting. No one but the bewildered kitchen maid had seen him leave the house, and no one else had seen the gentleman who accompanied him. All inquiries in the neighbourhood failed to elicit the memory of a stranger's presence that day in the neighbourhood of Ling, and no one had met Edward Boyne, either alone or in company, in any of the neighbouring villages, or on the road across the downs, or at either of the local railway stations. The sunny English noon had swallowed him as completely as if he had gone out into Cimmerian night. Mary, while every external means of investigation was working at its highest pressure, had ransacked her husband's papers for any trace of antecedent complications, of entanglements or obligations unknown to her, that might throw a faint ray into the darkness. But if any such had existed in the background of Boyne's life, they had disappeared as completely as the slip of paper on which the visitor had written his name. There remained no possible thread of guidance except, if it were indeed an exception, the letter which Boyne had apparently been in the act of writing when he received his mysterious summons. That letter, read and reread by his wife and submitted by her to the police, yielded little enough for conjecture to feed on. "I have just heard of Elwell's death, and while I suppose there is now no farther risk of trouble, it might be safer." That was all. The risk of trouble was easily explained by the newspaper clipping which had apprised Mary of the suit brought against her husband by one of his associates in the Blue Star enterprise. The only new information conveyed in the letter was the fact of its showing Boyne, when he wrote it, to be still apprehensive of the results of the suit, though he had assured his wife that it had been withdrawn, and though the letter itself declared that the plaintiff was dead. It took several weeks of exhaustive cabling to fix the identity of the parvis to whom the fragmentary communication was addressed, but even after these inquiries had shown him to be a Waukesha lawyer, no new facts concerning the Elwell suit were elicited. He appeared to have had no direct concern in it, but to have been conversant with the facts merely as an acquaintance and possible intermediary, and he declared himself unable to divine with what object Boyne intended to seek his assistance. This negative information, sole fruit of the first fortnight's feverish search, was not increased by a jot during the slow weeks that followed. Mary knew that the investigations were still being carried on, but she had a vague sense of their gradually slackening as the actual march of time seemed to slacken. It was as though the days, flying horror-struck from the shrouded image of the one inscrutable day, gained assurance as the distance lengthened, till at last they fell back into their normal gait. And so with the human imaginations at work on the dark event. No doubt it occupied them still, but week by week and hour by hour it grew less absorbing, took up less space, was slowly but inevitably crowded out of the foreground of consciousness by the new problems perpetually bubbling up from the vaporous cauldron of human experience. Even Mary Boyne's consciousness gradually felt the same lowering of velocity. It still swayed with the incessant oscillations of conjecture, but they were slower, more rhythmical in their beat. There were moments of overwhelming lassitude when, like the victim of some poison which leaves the brain clear, but holds the body motionless, she saw herself domesticated with the horror, accepting its perpetual presence as one of the fixed conditions of life. These moments lengthened into hours and days, till she passed into a phase of stolid acquiescence. She watched the familiar routine of life with the incurious eye of a savage, on whom the meaningless processes of civilization make but the faintest impression. She had come to regard herself as part of the routine, a spoke of the wheel, revolving with its motion. She felt almost like the furniture of the room in which she sat, an insensate object to be dusted and pushed about with the chairs and tables. And this deepening apathy held her fast at Ling, in spite of the urgent entreaties of friends and the usual medical recommendation of change. Her friends supposed that her refusal to move was inspired by the belief that her husband would one day return to the spot from which he had vanished, and a beautiful legend grew up about this imaginary state of waiting. But in reality she had no such belief. The depths of anguish enclosing her were no longer lighted by flashes of hope. She was sure that Boyne would never come back, that he had gone out of her sight as completely as if death itself had waited that day on the threshold. She had even renounced one by one the various theories as to his disappearance, which had been advanced by the press, the police, and her own agonized imagination. In sheer lassitude, her mind turned from these alternatives of horror and sank back into the blank fact that he was gone. No, she would never know what had become of him. No one would ever know. But the house knew, the library in which she spent her long lonely evenings knew, for it was here that the last scene had been enacted, here that the stranger had come and spoken the word which had caused Boyne to rise and follow him. The floor she trod had felt his tread, the books on the shelves had seen his face, and there were moments when the intense consciousness of the old dusky walls seemed about to break out into some audible revelation of their secret. But the revelation never came, and she knew it would never come. Ling was not one of the garrulous old houses that betray the secrets entrusted to them. Its very legend proved that it had always been the mute accomplice, the incorruptible custodian of the mysteries it had surprised, and Mary Boyne, sitting face to face with its portentous silence, felt the futility of seeking to break it by any human means. "I don't say it wasn't straight, yet don't say it was straight. It was business." Mary, at the words, lifted her head with a start and looked intently at the speaker. When, half an hour before, a card with Mr. Parvis on it had been brought up to her, she had been immediately aware that the name had been a part of her consciousness ever since she had read it at the head of Boyne's unfinished letter. In the library she had found awaiting her a small, neutral-tinted man, with a bald head and gold eyeglasses, and it sent a strange tremor through her to know that this was the person to whom her husband's last known thought had been directed. Parvis, civilly but without vain preamble, in the manner of a man who has his watch in his hand, had set forth the object of his visit. He had run over to England on business, and finding himself in the neighbourhood of Dorchester, had not wished to leave it without paying his respects to Mrs. Boyne, without asking her, if the occasion offered, what she meant to do about Bob Elwell's family. The words touched the spring of some obscure dread in Mary's bosom. Did her visitor, after all, know what Boyne had meant by his unfinished phrase? She asked for an elucidation of his question, and noticed at once that he seemed surprised at her continued ignorance of the subject. Was it possible that she really knew as little as she said? "I know nothing, you must tell me," she faltered out, and her visitor thereupon proceeded to unfold his story. It threw, even to her confused perceptions and imperfectly initiated vision, a lurid glare on the whole hazy episode of the Blue Star Mine. Her husband had made his money in that brilliant speculation at the cost of getting ahead of someone less alert to seize the chance. The victim of his ingenuity was young Robert Elwell, who had put him on to the Blue Star scheme. Parvis, at Mary's first startled cry, had thrown her a sobering glance through his impartial glasses. Bob Elwell wasn't smart enough, that's all. If he had been, he might have turned round and served Boyne the same way. It's the kind of thing that happens every day in business. "I guess it's what the scientists call the survival of the fittest," said Mr. Parvis, evidently pleased with the aptness of his analogy. Mary felt her physical shrinking from the next question she tried to frame. It was as though the words on her lips had a taste that nauseated her. "But then, you accuse my husband of doing something dishonourable." Mr. Parvis surveyed the question dispassionately. "Oh, no, I don't even say it wasn't straight." He glanced up and down the long lines of books as if one of them might have supplied him with the definition he sought. "I don't say it wasn't straight, and yet I don't say it was straight. It was business. After all, no definition in his category could be more comprehensive than that." Mary sat staring at him with a look of terror. He seemed to her like the indifferent, implacable emissary of some dark, formless power. "But Mr. Elwell's lawyers apparently did not take your view, since I suppose the suit was withdrawn by their advice." "Oh yes, they knew he hadn't a leg to stand on technically. It was when they advised him to withdraw the suit that he got desperate. You see, he'd borrowed most of the money he lost in the Blue Star, and he was up a tree. That's why he shot himself when they told him he had no show." The horror was sweeping over Mary in great deafening waves. He shot himself? He killed himself because of that? Well, he didn't kill himself exactly. He dragged on 2 months before he died. Parvis emitted the statement as unemotionally as a gramophone grinding out its record. You mean that he tried to kill himself and failed? And tried again? Oh, he didn't have to try again, said Parvis grimly. They sat opposite each other in silence, he swinging his eyeglass thoughtfully about his finger, she motionless, her arms stretched along her knees in an attitude of rigid tension. But if you knew all this, she began at length, hardly able to force her voice above a whisper, how is it that when I wrote you at the time of my husband's disappearance, you said you didn't understand his letter? Parvis received this without perceptible discomfiture. Why, I didn't understand it, strictly speaking, and it wasn't the time to talk about it if I had. The Elwell business was settled when the suit was withdrawn. Nothing I could have told you would have helped you to find your husband. Mary continued to scrutinize him. Then why are you telling me now? Still Parvis did not hesitate. Well, to begin with, I supposed you knew more than you appear to. I mean about the circumstances of Elwell's death. And then people are talking of it now. The whole matter's been raked up again. And I thought, if you didn't know, you ought to... She remained silent, and he continued. You see, it's only come out lately what a bad state Elwell's affairs were in. His wife's a proud woman, and she fought on as long as she could, going out to work and taking sewing at home when she got too sick, something with the heart, I believe. But she had his bedridden mother to look after, and the children, and she broke down under it, and finally had to ask for help. That attracted attention to the case, and the papers took it up, and a subscription was started. Everybody out there liked Bob Elwell, and most of the prominent names in the place are down on the list, and people began to wonder why. Parvis broke off to fumble in an inner pocket. Here, he continued, here's an account of the whole thing from the Sentinel. A little sensational, of course, but I guess you'd better look it over. He held out a newspaper to Mary, who unfolded it slowly, remembering as she did so the evening when, in that same room, the perusal of a clipping from the Sentinel had first shaken the depths of her security. As she opened the paper, her eyes shrinking from the glaring headlines, Widow of Boyne's victim forced to appeal for aid, ran down the column of text to 2 portraits inserted in it. The first was her husband's, taken from a photograph made the year they had come to England. It was the picture of him that she liked best, the one that stood on the writing table upstairs in her bedroom. As the eyes in the photograph met hers, she felt it would be impossible to read what was said of him, and closed her lids with the sharpness of the pain. I thought if you felt disposed to put your name down... She heard Parvis continue. She opened her eyes with an effort, and they fell on the other portrait. It was that of a youngish man, slightly built in rough clothes, with features somewhat blurred by the shadow of a projecting hat brim. Where had she seen that outline before? She stared at it confusedly, her heart hammering in her throat and ears. Then she gave a cry. This is the man who came for my husband. She heard Parvis start to his feet, and was dimly aware that she had slipped backward into the corner of the sofa, and that he was bending above her in alarm. With an intense effort she straightened herself and reached out for the paper, which she had dropped. It's the man! I should know him anywhere, she cried in a voice that sounded in her own ears like a scream. Parvis's voice seemed to come to her from far off, down endless fog-muffled windings. Mrs. Boyne, you're not very well. Shall I call somebody? Shall I get a glass of water? No, no, no! She threw herself towards him, her hand frantically clenching the newspaper. I tell you, it's the man. I know him. He spoke to me in the garden. Parvis took the journal from her, directing his glasses to the portrait. It can't be, Mrs. Boyne. It's Robert Elwell. Robert Elwell. Her white stare seemed to travel into space. Then it was Robert Elwell who came for him. Came for Boyne the day he went away. Parvis's voice dropped as hers rose. He bent over, laying a fraternal hand on her. as if to coax her gently back into her seat. "Why, Elwell was dead. Don't you remember?" Mary sat with her eyes fixed on the picture, unconscious of what he was saying. "Don't you remember Boyne's unfinished letter to me, the one you found on his desk that day? It was written just after he'd heard of Elwell's death." She noticed an odd shake in Parvis's unemotional voice. "Surely you remember that," he urged her. Yes, she remembered. That was the profoundest horror of it. Elwell had died the day before her husband's disappearance, and this was Elwell's portrait. And it was the portrait of the man who had spoken to her in the garden. She lifted her head and looked slowly about the library. The library could have borne witness that it was also the portrait of the man who had come in that day to call Boyne from his unfinished letter. Through the misty surgings of her brain she heard the faint boom of half-forgotten words. Words spoken by Alida Stair on the lawn at Pangbourne before Boyne and his wife had ever seen the house at Ling, or had imagined that they might one day live there. "This was the man who spoke to me," she repeated. She looked again at Parvis. He was trying to conceal his disturbance under what he imagined to be an expression of indulgent commiseration, but the edges of his lips were blue. "He thinks me mad, but I'm not mad," she reflected, and suddenly there flashed upon her a way of justifying her strange affirmation. She sat quiet, controlling the quiver of her lips, and waiting till she could trust her voice to keep its habitual level. Then she said, looking straight at Parvis, "Will you answer me one question, please? When was it that Robert Elwell tried to kill himself?" When? Parvis stammered. "Yes, the date. Please try to remember." She saw that he was growing still more afraid of her. "I have a reason," she insisted gently. Yes, only I can't remember. About 2 months before, I should say." "I want the date," she repeated. Parvis picked up the newspaper. "We might see here," he said, still humouring her. He ran his eyes down the page. "Here it is. Last October, She caught the words from him. "The 20th, wasn't it?" With a sharp look at her, he verified. "Yes, the 20th. Then you did know." "I know now." Her white stare continued to travel past him. "Sunday, the 20th. That was the day he came first." Parvis's voice was almost inaudible. "Came here first?" "Yes." "You saw him twice, then?" "Yes, twice." She breathed it at him with dilated eyes. "He came first on the 20th of October. I remember the date because it was the day we went up Meldon Steep for the first time." She felt a faint gasp of inward laughter at the thought that, but for that, she might have forgotten. Parvis continued to scrutinize her, as if trying to intercept her gaze. "We saw him from the roof," she went on. "He came down the lime avenue toward the house. He was dressed just as he is in that picture. My husband saw him first. He was frightened and ran down ahead of me, but there was no one there. He had vanished." "Elwell had vanished?" Parvis faltered. "Yes." Their two whispers seemed to grope for each other. "I couldn't think what had happened. I see now. He tried to come then, but he wasn't dead enough. He couldn't reach us. He had to wait for 2 months, and then he came back again. And Ned went with him." She nodded at Parvis with the look of triumph of a child who has successfully worked out a difficult puzzle. But suddenly she lifted her hands with a desperate gesture, pressing them to her bursting temples. "Oh my God! I sent him to Ned! I told him where to go! I sent him to this room!" she screamed out. She felt the walls of the room rush toward her, like inward falling ruins, and she heard Parvis, a long way off, as if through the ruins, crying to her and struggling to get at her. But she was numb to his touch. She did not know what he was saying. Through the tumult she heard but one clear note, the voice of Alida Stair, speaking on the lawn at Pangbourne. "You won't know till afterward," it said. "You won't know till long, long afterward." The end.